The wind howled across the empty plains, lifting dry dust into the air and painting the horizon in faded shades of orange and brown. The sun, slipping low behind the mountains, cast long, thin shadows over the cracked earth. It was the kind of silence that made you feel small, like the land itself was too big, too wild, and too untamed for any person to ever truly belong to it. But men still tried. Some tried to build towns, some tried to raise families, and some chose a different life entirely. This is a story about those men, the ones who chose the lawless path. They were called bandits, outlaws, or worse, depending on who was telling the story. To the townsfolk, they were nothing more than thieves and killers, heartless men who had traded decency for gold. But to others, they were survivors, shaped by a brutal world where the choice was often to take or be taken from. And in the Wild West, taking usually came with a price that could only be paid in blood. On nights like this, when the wind carried the smell of dry grass and old gunpowder, a man like Clay McGraw would sit by the fire and wonder if he had made the right choice. Clay wasn't born an outlaw. Few of them were. He used to be a ranch hand, strong-backed and honest, the kind of man who minded his own business and worked sunup to sundown, just to earn a few dollars. But hard times had a way of changing a man. A drought came. The cattle died. The rancher who hired him vanished into debt. And when Clay's little brother fell sick and there was no money for medicine, he found himself standing at a crossroad that so many men faced back then: starve, beg, or take what you needed by force. The Wild West didn't forgive the weak. People like to imagine it as a land of adventure, but for most folks, it was a daily fight just to keep from going hungry. A bad harvest meant empty bellies. A broken leg could mean death because there was no doctor for miles. And when there was no law close enough to protect anyone, bandits thrived. They rode into lonely towns, pointed their guns at whoever looked too slow to resist, and rode out richer than before. It wasn't noble, and most of them knew it, but it was simple. Clay joined his first gang out of desperation, not cruelty. But once you joined, it wasn't easy to leave. His gang was small at first, just 5 men who called themselves the Grizzly Boys. They weren't famous like Jesse James or Butch Cassidy, but in the stretch of land between Dry Creek and Red Rock Canyon, folks spoke their name in hushed tones. They robbed stagecoaches, stole cattle, and sometimes hit small banks in towns where the sheriff had more fear than bullets. What most people don't realize about bandit life is how hard it was, even for the ones doing the robbing. Food was scarce. Sleep was short. You were always riding, always moving, because if you stayed in one place too long, someone would recognize you. And then there was the constant paranoia. Every man in the gang slept with one eye open because the worst danger didn't always come from sheriffs or bounty hunters. It came from the men sitting next to you. Outlaws weren't known for loyalty. One cold evening, Clay sat by the fire with 2 of his gang members, men named Tate and Wheeler. The fire popped and cracked, sending sparks into the black night sky. They had just finished splitting a loaf of stale bread when Tate spat into the dirt and muttered, "This ain't no way to live." Wheeler gave him a hard look. "You think there's some other way? You seen any jobs out here paying a man what we take in a week?" Tate didn't answer, just stared at the flames. Clay stayed quiet too, but his mind wandered. He thought about his brother, about the promise he made to send money back home. He hadn't sent a single dollar in weeks. The money he stole barely stayed in his pocket long enough to be spent. Gambling, drinking, bribes to keep silent townsfolk quiet. It all disappeared fast. And then there was the law. They weren't as quick as legends made them seem, but they were patient. A sheriff might not chase you for miles, but he'd send word to bounty hunters, and those men didn't quit. Some of them were worse than the bandits themselves. Ruthless trackers who didn't care how much blood spilled as long as they collected their reward. Clay knew one was after them now. A bounty hunter named Miles Kettering. People said he was quiet, always wearing a black duster coat, with a face weathered by sun and hate. He didn't drink, didn't talk, didn't smile, just tracked. And once he was on your trail, it was only a matter of time. The gang had seen his name on wanted posters. Rumors said he shot 3 men in the back during a chase, and no one dare question it, because in the Wild West, justice wasn't about fairness. It was about who survived. That night, as the fire burned low, Clay felt something shift in the air. A sound carried on the wind. Hooves, faint and steady, coming from the south. Tate froze, gripping his rifle. Wheeler's eyes darted to the darkness. Clay slowly stood, his hand resting on his revolver. The gang had an unspoken rule. No one rode toward them at night unless they meant trouble. The hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped altogether. The silence returned, heavier this time, like the world was holding its breath. Somewhere out in the dark, a man was watching them. Clay couldn't see him, but he felt it. Felt the way the hair on his neck rose, the way his heart began to pound. Wheeler whispered, "It's him. It's Kettering." Tate cursed under his breath. "How could he find us out here? We crossed 2 rivers double back." "Doesn't matter," Clay said quietly. "If it's him, we're already too late." The 3 men stood there, tense, guns drawn, staring into the shadows. The firelight flickered across their faces, making them look older, more tired than they really were. And then, just as Clay was about to step forward, a single voice cut through the dark, calm and cold. "McGraw," the voice called. Clay froze. His name. Not the gang's name. Not Grizzly Boys. His name. Whoever it was out there wasn't here for all of them. He was here for Clay. And that was the moment Clay realized something he had tried to ignore for weeks. Someone had betrayed him. The night seemed to stretch as Clay stood frozen, his fingers brushing against the worn grip of his revolver. Tate shifted uneasily, his rifle trembling just enough for the barrel to catch the glow of the firelight. Wheeler muttered something under his breath, but the words were lost in the wind. None of them dared to move. The only sound was the soft crackle of burning wood and the steady beat of Clay's heart pounding in his ears. The voice spoke again, low and steady. "Come out, McGraw. Don't make me drag you from that fire." It was strange how calm it sounded. Not angry, not even threatening, just certain. Like the man saying it already knew how this night would end. Clay swallowed hard, eyes darting to Tate and Wheeler. "You sure it's Kettering?" Tate whispered, his voice rough. Clay didn't answer. He didn't have to. There weren't many men who could find them in a place this remote, and even fewer who would stand out there waiting instead of firing first. The silence stretched again, heavy and sharp. Wheeler's jaw tightened as he hissed. "What now? We ain't just handing you over." Clay glanced at him, unsure whether to feel grateful or worried. "If it's him, fighting won't end well," Clay said, keeping his voice low. "He'll pick us off one by one." Tate cursed again, louder this time. "So what? We just let him take you? You think he'll stop with just you? You know how these bounty hunters work. He'll shoot us too if it means less trouble." Clay stayed quiet. Tate wasn't wrong. Kettering had a reputation for cleaning up a scene. Dead men didn't argue, didn't testify, didn't follow him later for revenge. The voice came again, closer this time. "You've got 1 minute, McGraw." Something about the way he said Clay's name sent a chill crawling up his spine. This wasn't just about money. Kettering wasn't just hunting a bounty. He wanted Clay specifically, and that meant there was more to this than a wanted poster nailed to a saloon wall. Wheeler gripped Clay's shoulder. "We can ride out the other way. Saddle up and run for it before he gets close." But Clay shook his head. "We'd never make it. If he's here, he's got our trail mapped out already. We ride blind. He's waiting." Tate growled in frustration and kicked dirt to the fire. Sparks jumped and scattered, glowing briefly before vanishing in the dark. "So what do we do? Sit here like cattle waiting for slaughter?" Clay didn't answer right away. His mind was turning, weighing what little options they had. Running meant death. Fighting meant death. But staying put, that meant letting Kettering call the shots, and Clay had spent too long being pushed around by life to let that happen now. He stood slowly, adjusting the brim of his dusty hat. "I'll go," Clay said finally. Tate's head snapped up. "What? You can't just." "I'll go," Clay repeated firmly. "This is between me and him. You two ride out before dawn. Head east, get across the canyon before the sun's up." Wheeler frowned. "You think he's just going to let us go after you step out there?" "I think." Clay paused, then gave a tired half-smile. "I think if he wanted all of us dead, he'd have shot by now. He called my name for a reason." Tate cursed under his breath again, pacing near the fire. "This is suicide, Clay. You ain't even got a plan." "I don't need a plan," Clay said, pulling his revolver from its holster and checking the chamber. I just need to keep you two alive. Go. When I step out there, you pack up and ride. No arguing. Wheeler looked like he wanted to protest, but one glance at Clay's face stopped him. There was something in Clay's eyes, something tired, something resigned. Wheeler nodded reluctantly. You better not die for nothing, McGraw. Clay gave no answer, just stepped away from the fire and into the dark. The night swallowed him almost immediately, the warmth of the flames fading as he moved toward the sound of where Kettering's voice had come from. His boots crunched softly on the dry dirt, and every step felt louder than it should have. Clay McGraw, the voice called again, closer now. I was starting to think you'd run. I don't run, Clay said, his own voice steady despite the tension twisting in his chest. What do you want, Kettering? Money? A fight? Or just the reward? A shadow shifted ahead, then stepped into the faint light of the moon. Miles Kettering was just as the stories said, tall, lean, with a black duster coat that flapped slightly in the breeze. His face was lined with sunburned skin and hard edges, his eyes cold and unreadable. He carried a rifle slung over one shoulder and a revolver at his hip, but his hands rested loosely at his sides, as if he didn't need to try. This ain't about the reward, Kettering said calmly. Clay narrowed his eyes. Then what is it about? Kettering stared at him for a long moment, then stepped closer. You don't even know, do you? Clay felt his stomach twist. Know what? Kettering tilted his head slightly, his voice dropping lower. You robbed the wrong man, McGraw. 2 weeks ago, in Dry Creek, you hit a stagecoach. Took a lockbox. You remember it. Clay's mind flicked through memories, stagecoaches, gunfire, panic shouts. It was all a blur. I've robbed a lot of stagecoaches, Kettering. This one, Kettering interrupted, his tone sharpening, was carrying more than money. There was a woman on it. You might not remember her, but she sure as hell remembers you. She's the one paying me to bring you back alive. Clay froze. Alive. Kettering nodded once. She didn't ask for your gang. Didn't care about the others. Just you. Clay felt his throat tighten. Who was she? Kettering's cold expression didn't change. You'll find out when we get there. For a moment, Clay almost laughed. He had spent weeks imagining Kettering as a relentless killer who would shoot him on sight, but now he was being told someone wanted him alive. It should have been a relief, but somehow it felt worse. Alive meant answers. Alive meant facing whatever mistake he had made. Clay tried to keep his voice steady. You really think I'm just going to walk with you? Kettering's hand moved slightly, resting near his revolver. I think you ain't stupid enough to try and fight me. Clay glanced over his shoulder, back toward the fire where Tate and Wheeler waited. He wondered if they were already packing their saddles, if they were watching him right now, hoping he'd do something reckless. He turned back to Kettering, his jaw tight. And if I don't go? Kettering's eyes narrowed, his hand lowering to his holster. Then I bring you in dead instead. But like I said, she wants you alive. The way he said it, the quiet certainty, the hint of something unspoken, made Clay uneasy. Whoever this woman was, she had enough money or power to hire Kettering, and enough reason to risk keeping him breathing. Clay stood there, the cold wind tugging at his coat, his mind racing. Finally, he said, Give me one night. Kettering raised an eyebrow. One night for what? Clay swallowed hard. To fix something before I go with you. For the first time, Kettering's expression shifted, his lips pressing into a thin line, as if considering. The silence stretched again, broken only by the low whistle of the wind. Then Kettering said quietly, One night. At dawn, I'll be back. If you ain't here, his hand tapped the grip of his revolver. I'll hunt you down. Clay nodded, relief and dread mixing in his chest. Fair enough. Kettering gave a short nod, then turned and disappeared back into the darkness, his footsteps fading into silence. Clay stood there a moment longer, staring at the empty night. A woman from a stagecoach. A mistake he didn't even remember. And only one night to figure out what he had done before Kettering returned. He turned back toward the fire, his mind heavy with questions, unaware that someone much closer than Kettering, was already watching him from the shadows, waiting for him to make his next move. Clay walked back toward the fire, his boots dragging slightly as if every step carried the weight of the conversation he just had. Tate and Wheeler were still there, their faces tense, eyes flicking toward the darkness as if expecting Kettering to step out at any moment. "Well?" Tate asked sharply the second Clay stepped back into the glow of the firelight. "You kill him." Clay shook his head and sat down heavily, staring into the flames. "No." Tate's jaw dropped. "No? Then what the hell happened?" Wheeler, calmer but no less worried, crouched closer. "What did he want?" Clay rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the grit of the trail on his skin. "He's not here for the bounty. He was hired by a woman." Tate snorted. "A woman? Since when do bandits like us have ladies paying bounty hunters to chase us across half the desert? What did you do? Steal her fancy shoes?" Clay didn't respond. His mind was turning too fast to keep up with Tate's sarcasm. "It was a stagecoach. Couple weeks back. I guess she was on it." Wheeler frowned. "Which one?" "We've hit 3 in the last month." Clay thought back, trying to remember faces, moments. It all blurred together. Men shouting, the rush of adrenaline, the sound of gunfire. But then, faintly, he remembered something. A scream. A woman's voice, sharp and panicked, and a brief flash of her face as the gang rode away. He couldn't place her, but the memory clung to him. Tate threw up his hands. "So what? We robbed 100 folks. What's so special about her?" Clay stared into the fire, the orange flames licking at the night air. "I don't know. But she paid Kettering to bring me in alive. That's what's strange. If she just wanted revenge, she'd pay him to bring my head. But she doesn't." "Alive," Wheeler repeated quietly. "Means she wants something from you." Clay nodded slowly. "Yeah, and I got until dawn to figure out what it is." Tate scoffed and kicked at the dirt. "Dawn? Forget dawn. We pack up now and ride hard. Leave him in the dust. We've done it before." Clay shook his head firmly. "No. He's not just any bounty hunter, Tate. If we run, he'll follow, and he'll kill us all." Wheeler shifted uncomfortably. "He's right. Kettering ain't the kind of man you shake off with a fast horse. If he gave us till dawn, it's because he already knows he can find us again." Tate glared at both of them, frustration boiling over. "So what's your big plan, Clay? You gonna walk up to him in the morning with your hands tied and a smile? You think it's gonna save us?" "I don't know," Clay admitted, voice low. "But running won't. And I need answers. I need to know why she wants me." The fire popped loudly, a spark shooting into the air before vanishing into the night. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, as if the weight of what Clay said had settled over all of them. Tate muttered something under his breath and stalked off toward the horses, too angry to argue further. Wheeler stayed by the fire, watching Clay carefully. "You sure about this?" Wheeler asked. Clay nodded slowly, though doubt gnawed at him inside. "Yeah, I've been running for too long. Maybe it's time to stop." Wheeler studied him for a moment, then sighed. "All right, but if this goes bad, I'm not letting Tate ride off without you. We'll figure something out." Clay almost smiled. "Appreciate it." They sat in silence for a while, the crackle of the fire filling the quiet. The night stretched on, each minute ticking closer to dawn, but Clay's thoughts wouldn't settle. His mind kept returning to that brief memory. The flash of a woman's face, the panic in her eyes, the sound of her scream as they rode away. Somewhere out there, she was waiting. And whatever she wanted from him, it was important enough to hire a man like Kettering. Hours passed slowly. Tate eventually fell asleep near the fire, muttering in his dreams, while Wheeler kept watch. Clay stayed awake, staring into the flames, feeling the weight of the coming dawn pressing closer with every passing moment. Then, just as his eyelids started to feel heavy, a sound snapped him awake. A soft crunch of footsteps, quiet but close. Too close. Clay's hand went instantly to his revolver as he scanned the shadows beyond the firelight. Wheeler noticed too, standing slowly and gripping his rifle. "You hear that?" Wheeler whispered. Clay nodded, standing carefully, his eyes narrowing into the darkness. Tate was still asleep, oblivious to the tension. The sound came again, another step, slow and deliberate. Whoever wasn't trying to rush them. Clay raised his voice just enough to carry. Who's there? No answer. Wheeler adjusted his grip, stepping closer to Clay. Might be Kettering, checking on us. Clay shook his head. No. If it was Kettering, we wouldn't hear him at all. The footsteps stopped. The night fell silent again, the fire flickering as if nervous too. Clay strained to listen, his breath shallow. Then a voice came from the dark, softer than Kettering's, almost hesitant. Clay McGraw. Clay froze. The voice wasn't Kettering's. It was lighter, younger, almost nervous. Who's asking? Clay called, keeping his revolver raised. There was a pause. Then the figure stepped slowly into the firelight. It was a young man, no older than 20, with dust-covered clothes and wide, fearful eyes. His hands were raised, showing he carried no weapon. Please, the young man said, his voice trembling. I need to talk to you. It's about the woman. Clay's heart tightened. What woman? The young man swallowed hard, glancing nervously at Wheeler and the sleeping Tate before focusing back on Clay. She's coming for you, McGraw. Not just her. There are others. And if you don't leave tonight, you're not going to make it to dawn. Clay exchanged a quick look with Wheeler, his jaw tightening. Talk, Clay said, his voice low and sharp. Start talking now. The young man nodded quickly, stepping closer to the fire. Her name's Eleanor Hayes. She's not just some passenger you robbed, McGraw. She's the daughter of a railroad baron. Her family lost thousands when you hit that stagecoach. But that's not why she wants you alive. She doesn't care about the money. She cares about something you took from that lockbox. Something important. Clay frowned. What are you talking about? We only took cash. The young man shook his head desperately. No, there was a map in that lockbox. A railroad map, land rights, routes, all marked for expansion. Whoever controls, it controls every town along that track. You've been carrying it without even knowing what it was worth. Clay felt his stomach twist as the pieces started to fall into place. Eleanor Hayes didn't want revenge. She wanted that map back. And now, if what the young man was saying was true, she wasn't the only one after it. Clay's voice dropped lower. Why are you telling me this? The young man's eyes darted toward the dark horizon nervously. Because they're already close. Her hired men, not just Kettering, others. If you stay here, you'll all be dead before sunrise. The fire crackled loudly, sending sparks into the night as Clay processed his words. Tate shifted in his sleep, still unaware of the danger creeping closer. Wheeler looked at Clay, waiting for him to decide. And for the first time that night, Clay realized dawn wasn't just a deadline. It was a trap. Clay's jaw tightened as the young man's words sank in. He glanced toward the horizon, where the darkness stretched endlessly, quiet and still, but now it felt alive, like unseen eyes were watching from every shadow. You're sure about this? Clay asked, his voice low and serious. The young man nodded quickly. I rode 3 days to get here. I heard our men talking in Dry Creek. They're planning to hit your camp before dawn. They ain't bounty hunters, McGraw. They're killers. Once they've got that map, you're as good as dead. Wheeler cursed under his breath. Great. Just great. And here we were worried about one bounty hunter. Now it's a whole pack. Clay didn't answer right away. He turned his eyes to the fire, watching the flames dance, thinking. Tate stirred, mumbling something in his sleep, then finally woke up, rubbing his eyes. What's with all the whispering? Who's this kid? Clay looked at Tate. Trouble. That's who he is. Tate frowned, glancing between the young man and Wheeler. Somebody explain. Wheeler filled him in quickly, his voice sharp and clipped. By the time he finished, Tate's face had twisted into anger. So let me get this straight, Tate growled. Some fancy railroad lady sends her own private army after us. And we're just sitting here like ducks waiting to get shot? Hell no. We ride now. That's what I've been saying, the young man agreed, nodding frantically. You can't stay here. But Clay didn't move. His mind was racing. If we run, they'll track us. You think people like that don't have scouts? Horses faster than ours? We'd be dead by noon. Tate slammed his hand against his knee. So what? We just stay here? Wait for him to come? No, Clay said slowly, his eyes still on the fire. We don't wait. We move first. Wheeler raised an eyebrow. Move first? You mean fight him? Clay finally looked up, his expression calm but firm. We don't have a choice. If we run, they hunt us. If we hide, they find us. But if we strike first, we might just scare him off long enough to figure out what to do next. The young man's eyes widened in alarm. You can't fight them. There's too many. Clay's gaze fixed on him. How many? The young man hesitated. 5, maybe 6. But they're not like regular outlaws. They're hired guns. Paid well. Mean. Clay let out a slow breath, then looked at Wheeler and Tate. 5 or 6. We've handled worse. Tate's expression shifted from anger to a grim sort of determination. Now you're talking my language. Wheeler, though hesitant, gave a slow nod. We'll need a plan. Clay stood, brushing dirt from his coat. We've got a few hours before they get close. That's enough. He turned to the young man. You said you rode 3 days to warn me. Why? What's in it for you? The young man looked down, his jaw tightening. Because I worked for her once. I know what she's like. She'll kill you, and she won't care who else gets caught in the crossfire. I'm done helping people like her. Clay studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right. You stay, you help us. You know how they move. The young man hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Yeah, I know their habits. Good, Clay said, his voice steady. Then we got a chance. Tate grinned darkly. Finally, I was getting tired of running. The firelight flickered against their faces as Clay crouched, drawing a rough outline of the land in the dirt with a stick. We'll use the canyon edge, he explained. There's only one path they can ride through if they want to surprise us. We set up there, wait until they're close, and hit 'em hard before they can spread out. Wheeler crouched beside him, studying the rough map. We've only got 3 guns and a kid who might shoot his own foot. That's not much. Clay nodded. We make up for it with timing. Hit fast, scare 'em, and make 'em think there's more of us than there is. If they panic, they'll pull back. Tate chuckled. And if they don't panic? Clay looked at him seriously. Then we keep shooting until they're all down. The young man swallowed nervously, glancing toward the dark horizon. You really think this will work? Clay stood, holstering his revolver. I think it's the only chance we've got. The hours that followed were quiet but tense. They packed quickly, putting out the fire to keep from drawing attention. The night air grew colder as they moved toward the canyon edge, the moon casting long shadows across the rugged land. Clay led the way, his steps steady, his mind locked on the plan. Tate followed close behind, muttering under his breath about how much he hated waiting. Wheeler stayed near the back, keeping an eye on the young man, who looked like he might bolt at any moment. When they reached the canyon, Clay crouched low, scanning the land. The rocky walls created a narrow choke point, a perfect place for an ambush. We set up here, Clay whispered. Tate, you take the left side. Wheeler, right? I'll stay in the center. We wait for my signal. Tate nodded eagerly, gripping his rifle. Wheeler gave a slower nod, his face grim. The young man stayed crouched, his hands shaking slightly. The silence that followed was heavy. Every sound seemed louder than it should. The scrape of boots on rock, the distant cry of a night bird, even the whisper of the wind. Clay crouched behind a boulder, his revolver in hand, his eyes locked on the narrow path ahead. His heart pounded, but his mind stayed clear. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the waiting gnawing at their nerves. Then, faintly, the sound came. Hooves. Tate stiffened, his grip tightening on his rifle. Wheeler adjusted his position, raising his weapon. Clay stayed still, his breath slow and steady. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Shadows moved in the distance, dark figures on horseback, riding slow and careful. There were 6 of them, just as the young man had said, their silhouettes sharp against the pale moonlight. Clay watched as they drew closer, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Closer, closer, and then a rock shifted behind them. Clay's head snapped around just in time to see another shadow moving in the darkness. Not ahead, but behind them. A figure crouched low, creeping toward their position. Damn it, Clay whispered under his breath. They weren't the only ones planning an ambush tonight. The enemy had already circled around. Before Clay could signal the others, a gunshot cracked through the night, loud and sharp, lighting the darkness with a burst of flame. The canyon erupted into chaos. The canyon echoed with the sound of gunfire, each shot cracking sharp and loud against the stone walls. Clay ducked low behind the boulder as a bullet shattered rock just inches from his head, sending dust and tiny fragments into his face. Tate let out a curse, firing back blindly into the shadows, his rifle kicking against his shoulder. Wheeler stayed calm, crouched behind cover, taking careful shots, each one deliberate and measured. But it was chaos. The plan had been ruined the second that hidden gunman fired. The 6 riders who were supposed to walk into their trap were now scattering, shouting orders as they dismounted, using the rocky walls as cover. Clay could hear boots scrambling against stone, the scrape of metal against rock as the hired guns spread out. "Behind us!" Clay shouted, twisting around to get a better look at the shadow that had crept up earlier. Another shot rang out, and Clay spotted him. One of Eleanor Hayes' hired men crouching along the canyon wall, a dark bandana over his face, his rifle raised. Clay fired quick, his revolver kicking in his hand. The man ducked but stumbled, a shot grazing his shoulder. He cursed loudly and rolled behind a rock, but now they knew for sure. They were surrounded. Tate yelled over the noise. "We gotta move, Clay. We stay pinned here, we're dead." Clay gritted his teeth, scanning the canyon. Running meant losing the high ground, but staying meant getting picked apart slowly. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him, the kind that didn't allow for second chances. "We hold for now," Clay shouted back. "Make him think we've got more men than we do." Tate didn't look convinced, but he kept firing, his rifle cracking again and again. Wheeler shifted position, keeping his shots controlled, aiming only when he had a clear target. The young man, the one who had warned them, was crouched low, hands trembling, clearly in use to real gunfire. Clay spotted him ducking further behind a rock, his breathing fast and uneven. "You," Clay barked. "What's your name?" The young man looked up, startled, his face pale. "Sam. Sam, stay low and watch her back. If they try to circle around again, you yell." Sam nodded quickly, gripping a small pistol that looked too big for his shaking hands. Clay risked a glance over the edge of the boulder. The hired guns were moving carefully, trying to box them in, but they weren't rushing. That was worse. These weren't desperate bandits. They were trained men, paid well enough to take their time. A shot whizzed past, grazing Clay's sleeve, and he ducked back down. His mind raced. He needed to buy time, to make these men believe they were up against more than just 4 desperate outlaws. "Hey," Clay called. "Fire from different spots. Make it sound like there's more of us." Tate grinned despite the danger. Finally, something fun. He darted to another rock, firing from a different angle, shouting curses as if calling to other imaginary shooters. Wheeler caught on quickly, shifting positions and changing the rhythm of his shots. For a moment, it worked. Clay could hear hesitation in the voices of the hired men, the sound of boots scraping as they slowed, unsure of how many opponents they faced. But it wouldn't last long. These were professionals. They'd figure it out soon enough. Clay crouched lower, his mind flashing back to the conversation with Kettering earlier that night. The bounty hunter had said Eleanor Hayes wanted him alive, but he hadn't said anything about his gang. That meant these men had no reason to hold back on Wheeler, Tate, or Sam. The thought tightened Clay's chest. He looked over at Wheeler, who was reloading calmly despite the chaos, his face focused. Wheeler had been with him since the beginning, through every bad job and every narrow escape. Tate, for all his anger and reckless talk, had stuck by him too. Clay couldn't let them die for a mistake he didn't even remember making. A bullet struck the rock beside him, snapping him back to the present. The sound of voices carried from down the canyon, one louder than the rest, shouting orders. Clay strained to listen. The words were faint, but he caught a name, Hayes. Eleanor Hayes wasn't with them, but her name was enough to remind him why this was happening. A map, a stagecoach robbery, a lockbox he barely remembered. Somewhere, tucked away in their supplies, was a folded piece of paper worth more than any pile of stolen gold. Clay felt a wave of frustration. How could one mistake, one robbery out of dozens, bring this much trouble down on them? Another shot ricocheted off the stone near his head, showering him with grit. He had to think fast. "Wheeler!" Clay shouted. Do you still have the smoke rounds from Red Rock? Wheeler looked up, surprised, then nodded. 2 left. Good. Toss one to Tate. We're gonna make him blind. Wheeler reached into his pack, pulling out a small metal canister with a fuse, tossing it to Tate, who grinned the moment he caught it. Now we're talking, Tate yelled. Clay waited until the hired men fired another round, then shouted, Now! Wheeler lit his fuse and tossed the canister into the narrow path ahead. Tate followed, throwing his further down the canyon. Within seconds, thick gray smoke began to billow, curling through the canyon, swallowing the moonlight and twisting the shadows into a haze. Shouts rose from the hired men as the smoke rolled over them. Their careful formation broke, their shots going wild in the confusion. Move! Clay yelled. They shifted positions quickly, using the smoke as cover. Clay stayed low, moving toward a better vantage point along the canyon wall. Tate, laughing wildly, fired a few shots into the smoke just to keep them panicked. Sam stayed crouched near the back, his wide eyes darting nervously as the chaos grew louder. Clay slid into a new position, breathing hard. The smoke wouldn't last long, but it bought them a little time, and time was all they needed to make a new plan. He crouched behind another rock, tried to listen through the noise. The hired men were shouting, confused but not retreating. They weren't going to give up. Clay's mind turned quickly, weighing their options again. They couldn't stay. Not here. Not with 6 armed men closing in. They needed to move before the smoke cleared. Clay turned to Wheeler, who had crouched beside him. When the smoke clears, they'll push in fast. We need to get out of the canyon. Wheeler frowned. Where to? Clay hesitated, glancing toward the ridge above them. Up there. High ground. We can hold them off longer. Tate, who had crept closer, shook his head. Clem been in the middle of a gunfight? That's suicide. Clay looked at him sharply. Stay here, and it's worse. Tate didn't argue after that. The smoke was already starting to thin, patches of clear air breaking through. The shouts of the hired guns grew louder, closer. Clay tightened his grip on his revolver, his jaw set. We move on my word. Stay close, keep quiet, and don't stop for anything. The others nodded. Even Sam, though pale, gave a shaky nod. Clay's heart pounded in his chest as he counted the seconds, the sound of approaching boots echoing closer through the haze. 3 seconds. 2. 1. Now! Clay shouted. They darted from cover, racing toward the ridge as the smoke thinned around them, bullets whistling past, striking rock and dirt. The hired men shouted, realizing what was happening, but Clay didn't look back. They climbed fast, scrambling over loose rocks, using hands and feet to pull themselves higher. Tate cursed with every step. Wheeler stayed silent, and Sam slipped once but caught himself, his face white with fear. Bullets cracked against the rocks below, shards of stone flying into the air, but they didn't stop. Clay's fingers dug into the stone, pulling himself up higher, his muscles burning, his mind focused on one thought. If they could reach the top, they might survive the night. But as he pulled himself onto the narrow ledge near the top, Clay froze. There, crouched low and waiting, was a figure. A man dressed in black, rifle in hand, calm and steady. And Clay knew immediately who it was. Kettering. The bounty hunter was already here, and he was pointing his rifle straight at Clay. Clay froze, his breath catching in his throat as Kettering's rifle aimed squarely at his chest. The bounty hunter stood firm, his boots braced on the rocky ledge, his silhouette framed by the pale moonlight. His face was as calm as before, those cold eyes studying Clay like he was just another target. For a long second, neither man moved. Clay's fingers tightened on the edge of the rock, his revolver still holstered, his body hanging halfway between the canyon wall and the ledge. Behind him, Tate and Wheeler were still climbing, their boots scraping stone, unaware of who was waiting above. Kettering, Clay said finally, his voice low, try to buy a moment. Kettering didn't blink. I told you I'd be back at dawn. It ain't dawn yet, Clay replied, forcing a small, dry smile. You're early. The bounty hunter's expression didn't change, but his grip on the rifle didn't tighten either. You're making this harder than it needs to be, McGraw. I said alive, and I meant it. But if you pull that iron on me, his eyes narrowed slightly. I won't hesitate. Clay stayed still, his mind racing. The smoke below was clearing fast, and the hired guns would be on them any second. Kettering might have come for the bounty, but Eleanor's men wouldn't care whether Clay was alive or dead. "You see what's happening down there?" Clay asked, jerking his chin toward the canyon. "That ain't your fight, Kettering. Those are her men." "I know," Kettering said flatly. "Then you know she sent them to kill us all," Clay pressed. "She doesn't care if I'm alive when they find me. You really think they're going to hand me over to you nice and easy?" Kettering's eyes flicked briefly toward the smoke curling up from below, then back to Clay. "Doesn't change my job." Clay clenched his jaw. "What if I told you I could give you something better than her money?" Kettering tilted his head slightly. "What could you possibly offer me that's better than getting paid to drag you back to her doorstep?" Clay hesitated. He hadn't planned to use this card so soon, but he was running out of choices. "The map," Clay said finally. "The one she's after. I still got it." Kettering's eyes narrowed, just slightly, but for the first time his expression shifted. Curiosity flickered there. "She didn't just hire you because she wants me, Kettering," Clay continued, keeping his voice calm. "She wants that map, and if you hand me over, she gets it back. But if you take it instead," he let the words hang in the air. Kettering didn't move, but Clay could see his jaw tighten slightly, the only sign that the words were sinking in. Behind Clay, Tate was climbing closer, his voice carrying. "Clay, what the hell's taking so long up there?" Clay didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on Kettering, his voice low. "You pull that trigger, Kettering, and she wins. You let me up, and maybe we both walk away with more than she ever paid you." The bounty hunter stared at him for another long second. Then, slowly, Kettering lowered the rifle, just slightly but enough. "Get up here," Kettering said finally. "But if you try anything, McGraw, I'll drop you before you can draw." Clay nodded once and hauled himself onto the ledge, his boots scraping against the stone. Tate reached the top seconds later, his rifle already raised when he spotted Kettering. "What the hell?" Tate shouted, aiming his rifle at the bounty hunter. "Don't," Clay snapped, stepping between them. "He ain't shooting yet," Tate muttered, lowering the barrel reluctantly, but keeping his eyes locked on Kettering. Wheeler climbed up next, breathing hard, his eyes immediately narrowing when he saw who was waiting. "You sure about this, Clay?" "No," Clay admitted honestly, "but we don't have a choice." The gunfire below grew louder, echoing up the canyon walls. Shadows moved through the smoke, the hired men advancing fast. Kettering turned his head slightly, his calm voice cutting through the noise. "They'll be on us in minutes." "Then we move," Clay said. "You want to get paid, Kettering? Help us get out of here, and I'll tell you where that map is." Tate glared at him. "You're making deals with this snake now. You got a better idea?" Clay shot back. "Because if we stay here, we're all dead. You want to argue? Do it later." Tate grumbled something under his breath, but didn't argue further. Kettering gave a single nod. "Fine. But if you cross me, McGraw, the deal's done." "Fair enough," Clay said. The four of them crouched low, moving quickly along the narrow ridge, staying close to the rock wall for cover. The sound of boots and shouts below grew louder as Eleanor's men realized their targets were climbing. Bullets ricocheted against stone, some coming dangerously close, sending chips of rock flying. "Faster," Clay urged, leading the way along the ridge. The path narrowed in places, forcing them to move carefully despite the urgency. Tate cursed with every step, while Wheeler stayed focused, his rifle ready. Kettering moved with the calm precision of a man who'd done this 100 times before, his rifle slung across his back as he kept one hand near his revolver. Sam scrambled behind them, breathing hard, trying to keep up. They reached a sharp bend in the ridge, with a path opened slightly. Clay crouched low, scanning ahead. The ridge sloped upward toward a higher plateau, offering a better vantage point, and possibly a way out. But just as he moved forward, a shot rang out, striking the rock inches from his head. He ducked instantly as more bullets followed, shattering stone around them. "They're on the ridge," Tate shouted, firing back toward the source of the shots. Clay risked a glance and spotted two of Eleanor's men climbing fast on the opposite side of the ridge, their rifles raised. "Wheeler, cover!" Clay barked. Wheeler dropped to one knee, firing controlled shots to slow them down. Kettering crouched beside him, raising his rifle and taking aim with quick, precise movements. His first shot struck one of the climbing men, sending him tumbling backward, his body disappearing into the canyon below. The second man ducked behind a rock, returning fire. "We don't have time for this," Tate shouted. Clay looked up toward the plateau. "We move now. Kettering, keep him busy." The bounty hunter gave a short nod, reloading quickly. Tate and Wheeler followed Clay, scrambling upward toward the higher ground, while Kettering stayed crouched, firing to keep the men below pinned. Sam hesitated, looking back nervously, but Clay grabbed his arm and pulled him along. The climb was steep, the loose rocks sliding under their boots, but adrenaline pushed them forward. The shouts below grew louder as more of Eleanor's men tried to scale the canyon. Clay reached the top first, pulling himself onto the plateau and immediately scanning the land. The open stretch of rocky ground sloped downward toward a cluster of scattered boulders that could provide cover. Beyond that, the land dipped into another narrow pass, a possible escape route. "Go!" Clay shouted as Tate and Wheeler climbed up behind him. They moved quickly toward the boulders, bullets still cracking from below, though most shots missed at this distance. Kettering reached the top seconds later, calm as ever despite the chaos. "They're climbing fast," he said flatly. Clay nodded, ducking behind a boulder. "We hold here, just long enough to slow him down. Then we move to that pass." He pointed toward the narrow gap ahead. Tate crouched beside him, breathing hard. "And if they cut us off before we get there?" Clay checked his revolver, his jaw tight. "Then we make sure they don't." The plateau trembled slightly under their boots as more boots hit the ridge below. Shadows appeared against the moonlit rock, more men climbing up, their shouts carrying through the night. Clay tightened his grip on his revolver, his heartbeat steady despite the noise. This was it. They had minutes, maybe less, before the full fight hit them. And somewhere out there, Eleanor Hayes was waiting, certain her men would bring Clay in by morning. But Clay McGraw wasn't planning to let her win that easily. The cold night air bit at Clay's skin as he pressed his back against the boulder, his revolver ready. The moon cast pale, silver streaks over the rocky plateau, making every shadow seem like a figure creeping closer. Tate crouched beside him, his rifle across his knee, muttering curses under his breath. "This is insane, Clay. There's 6 of him and 4 of us. 5 if you count the kid, and I don't." Sam flinched at that, but Clay didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on the ridge where the hired guns were climbing. Wheeler crouched behind another boulder, calm but alert, his rifle braced against the rock. Kettering stood a few paces ahead, not even bothering to hide fully behind cover. The bounty hunter moved with a deliberate calm, scanning the ridge as if he was picking out targets at a shooting range, not standing in the middle of an ambush. The first shadow crested the top of the ridge, a man pulling himself up over the rock. Kettering fired before Clay could give the order, the rifle crack echoing sharply through the night. The man let out a strangled cry before falling backward into the canyon below. The others hesitated at the sound, but only for a moment. Then they started shouting orders, their boots scraping rock as more of them reached the plateau. "They're coming," Tate yelled, raising his rifle. "Hold your fire until you can see them clearly," Clay ordered, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. The next man came up fast, crouched low with his revolver ready. Clay waited, his breath slow, then fired when a man moved into the open. The shot hit his shoulder, spinning him around before he dropped to the ground. Another followed immediately, firing wildly as he climbed over the edge. Tate ducked as bullets struck the boulder beside him, chips of stone flying. He leaned out just enough to fire back, his shot striking the man in the leg and sending him sprawling. Wheeler stayed focused, his rifle steady as he picked off another figure trying to climb higher. The man collapsed silently, sliding back down the ridge. "3 down," Kettering said, his voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather. "Don't get cocky," Clay replied, peering over the rock. More shadows moved below, still climbing. Tate fired again, his laughter sharp and wild. "This ain't half bad. I almost feel sorry for him." "Don't feel sorry yet," Wheeler said flatly. "They're not quitting." He was right. The hired guns weren't panicking. They were adapting. Clay could hear them shouting to each other, their boots shifting as they spread out, looking for another way up. Kettering crouched beside Clay, his rifle still aimed toward the ridge. "They're going to try to flank us. Two will push from the left while the rest keep us pinned." Clay nodded. "I was thinking the same thing." Tate glanced at them, annoyed. "You two want to stop having polite conversations and maybe tell me what we're doing about it." Clay's mind worked quickly. "Wheeler, you stay here and keep firing. Make him think we're all still holding this position. Tate, you move left, stay low, and take out anyone try to circle us." Tate smirked. "Finally, something I'm good at." Clay looked at Kettering. "You with me? We move to the pass before they can cut us off." Kettering raised an eyebrow slightly. "You trust me at your back already?" Clay didn't look at him. "Not really. But you want that map. You'll keep me alive long enough to get it." For the first time that night, Kettering almost smiled. Almost. The plan went into motion fast. Tate darted left, crouching low and weaving between rocks. Wheeler stayed put, firing in steady intervals to keep the hired guns pinned. Clay and Kettering moved toward the pass, keeping close to the boulders for cover. Sam followed behind Clay nervously, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. The air felt heavier with every step, as if the canyon itself was holding its breath. The shouts grew louder, boots scraping rock as the hired men climbed higher. Clay could hear Tate's rifle crack from the left, followed by a muffled shout. Tate laughed loudly. "Got one. Keep moving," Clay called back. The pass was only a few yards ahead now, a narrow gap between two tall rocks that dipped down toward the slope beyond. If they could reach it, they might slip out before the hired guns regrouped. But just as Clay neared the gap, a shot rang out from above, striking the rock beside him. He ducked instantly, pulling Sam down with him. "Sniper," Kettering said calmly, his eyes scanning the ridge. Clay risked a glance upward and spotted him, a man lying prone along a higher ledge, his rifle aimed straight at their position. "We can't move while he's got the angle," Clay muttered. "I can take him," Kettering said. Clay looked at him sharply. "You sure?" Kettering was already adjusting his rifle, kneeling behind a boulder. His movements were quick, precise, like a man who'd done this 100 times. He waited for just the right moment, then fired. The sniper jerked backward, his rifle slipping from his hands as he tumbled down the ledge. Kettering stood, reloading smoothly. "Move!" Clay didn't argue. They rushed toward the pass, the rocky ground crunching under their boots. Sam stumbled once, but caught himself, his face pale and sweating. As they slipped through the narrow gap, the sound of gunfire echoed behind them. Wheeler holding the ridge, buying them more time. "Tate!" Clay shouted over the noise. "Fall back to the pass." "Already on it," Tate called, his boots pounding against stone as he ran back toward them. Wheeler was the last to move, backing away slowly as he fired a few final shots before sprinting toward the gap. They regrouped quickly on the other side of the pass, crouched behind another cluster of boulders. The slope ahead stretched downward toward the darker plains beyond, the moonlight shimmering faintly over the distant land. "We can make it if we keep moving," Clay said, his breathing heavy but controlled. Tate dropped beside him, grinning despite the danger. "This is the most fun I've had in weeks." Wheeler gave him a look. "You're insane." Clay scanned the ridge above, listening for the shouts. The hired guns were still coming, but slower now, cautious after losing too many men. "We head for the plains," Clay said. "Once we're out of the canyon, we'll have more room to move, maybe lose him in the dark." Kettering adjusted his rifle, his expression unreadable. "And after that," Clay met his gaze. "After that, you and I have a talk about that map." For a brief moment, the two men just stared at each other, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. Then a sound cut through the night, sharp and clear, a single distant whistle. Clay froze. The hired guns weren't retreating. They weren't regrouping. That whistle was a signal. "They've got more men coming," Kettering said flatly. "More?" Tate groaned. "How many more?" As if answering, The distant sound of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon, growing louder, closer. Clay's stomach tightened. The first wave had just been the beginning. Eleanor Hayes wasn't taking any chances. And now, as the pounding of horses grew louder in the darkness, Clay realized they might not make it to the plains at all. The hoofbeats grew louder, thundering through the canyon walls like a warning drum. Clay crouched low behind the rocks, every muscle tense, his mind racing for options. Tate cursed under his breath, gripping his rifle tighter, while Wheeler shifted his position, his eyes scanning the open slope ahead. Sam pressed himself against the stone, his breathing shallow, clearly terrified but trying to stay quiet. Kettering stayed unervingly calm, his rifle balanced against his knee, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon where the new riders would soon appear. "She sent more men than I expected," he said, his voice almost casual, though his jaw was tight. Clay shot him a look. "You expected this at all?" Kettering didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. The sound of the riders grew closer, joined now by faint voices shouting orders. They weren't coming recklessly like the first group. These men were organized, moving with precision. Eleanor Hayes hadn't sent just another wave of hired guns. She had sent the ones who knew how to hunt. Tate shook his head. "We can't outrun horses, Clay. Not in this kind of terrain." "We don't have to outrun them," Clay replied, his voice low. "We just have to make them lose us long enough to get out of the canyon." "And how do you plan to do that?" Wheeler asked, his tone calm, but edged with doubt. Clay glanced at the slope ahead. It dipped into a stretch of broken land, dotted with boulders and dry brush. Beyond that, in the distance, he could see faint ridges, darker against the night sky. If they could reach those ridges, they might vanish into the rocky maze before the riders caught up. "We head for those ridges," Clay said. "If we move fast and split up for a while, they'll have to divide to follow us. We regroup later." Tate stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Split up? That's your plan? You got a better one." Clay shot back. Tate opened his mouth to argue, then shut it, clearly frustrated but unable to disagree. Kettering finally spoke, his voice level. "If we split, she'll focus on the one carrying the map." Clay looked at him sharply. "And you think that's me?" "I know it's you," Kettering said without hesitation. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the tension sharp between them. Sam looked nervously from one to the other, as if expecting a fight to break out right there. But before Clay could respond, the hoofbeats grew closer still, echoing off the canyon walls. The riders were almost on them. Clay took a breath, forcing himself to focus. "We move on my signal. Tate, you head left. Wheeler, right? Take the kid with you." Sam started to protest, but Clay cut him off. "You'll be safer with Wheeler." "And you?" Tate asked, his tone wary. "I'll take the center," Clay said. His eyes shifted briefly to Kettering. "And he's with me." Tate looked ready to argue again, but there was no time. Clay stood, checking his revolver one last time. "Go!" They moved quickly, darting down the slope into the broken land below. The crunch of loose rock under their boots was drowned out by the growing thunder of approaching horses. Tate veered left, disappearing between two large boulders. Wheeler grabbed Sam by the arm, pulling him toward the right, keeping low as they ran. Clay and Kettering stayed in the middle, moving fast, weaving through the uneven ground. The first glimpse of the riders came seconds later, dark shapes silhouetted against the moonlight, their horses kicking up dust as they charged into the canyon. Shouts rose as the riders split, some following Tate's trail, others veering after Wheeler. But as Kettering had predicted, most of them focused on the center, their eyes set on Clay. "They know who they're after," Kettering said, keeping pace beside him. "Good," Clay replied, his voice sharp. "Keeps the others safer." The ground sloped unevenly, forcing them to move carefully despite the urgency. Clay glanced back once, catching sight of the riders closing in fast. Sparks flew as horseshoes struck stone, their riders leaning low in the saddle, rifles slung across their backs. Kettering slowed slightly, raising his rifle and firing a quick, precise shot. One of the horses reared, throwing its rider to the ground. The others didn't slow. Clay kept moving, his breath heavy but controlled. The ridges ahead were closer now, dark and jagged against the night sky. If they could reach them, they might slip into one of the narrow gullies and disappear. A bullet whistled past his shoulder, striking the dirt ahead. Clay ducked instinctively, his heart hammering faster. Kettering fired again, another rider dropping from his saddle, but still they came. The slope leveled briefly before rising again, leading to the ridges. Clay pushed harder, his legs burning as they climbed. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder still, too close now. "They're gaining," Kettering said, his voice steady despite the urgency. "I noticed," Clay replied. Another shot cracked, and Clay felt a sharp sting along his arm, a grazing hit. He stumbled but kept moving, his jaw clenched against the pain. The ridges loomed closer, their shadows deep and jagged. Just a little further, a rider broke from the group behind them, spurring his horse harder. He was faster than the rest, closing the gap quickly, his revolver raised. Clay spun, firing a quick shot. The rider ducked low, his bullet missing, and kept coming. Kettering fired once, his shot striking the horse's leg. The animal stumbled, throwing the rider hard to the ground. But more were coming, too many to fight head-on. Clay turned back toward the ridges, his chest heaving as they climbed the final stretch. The rocky ground made the horses slow slightly, buying them precious seconds. As they reached the first narrow gap between two ridges, Clay darted inside, the walls of stone rising high around them. The path twisted sharply, the shadows deep, perfect for losing anyone who didn't know the land. Kettering followed close behind, glancing back only briefly before disappearing into the gap. The hoofbeats thundered closer, echoing against the canyon walls. The riders were almost there. Clay pushed deeper into the ridge, weaving through the narrow turns, his boots crunching against loose gravel. His breath came heavy now, the adrenaline surging through him. Finally, they reached a wider hollow where the ridges split into multiple narrow paths. Clay stopped, glancing around quickly. "This way," he said, choosing the tightest gap, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. "Horses won't fit here." Kettering followed without question, slipping into the narrow gap as the sound of riders filled the ridge behind them. The two men pressed forward, the tight walls scraping their shoulders, until they were swallowed fully by the shadows. Behind them, the sound of hoofbeats stopped abruptly, followed by angry shouts as the riders realized they couldn't follow. Clay exhaled slowly, leaning against the rock wall, his chest rising and falling with each heavy breath. For now, they had escaped. But as the cold night wind whistled through the narrow pass, Clay knew it wouldn't last. Eleanor Hayes wouldn't stop until she had what she wanted. And if she couldn't catch him here, she'd find another way. Kettering glanced at him, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You bought us time, McGraw, but time won't change how this ends." Clay met his gaze, his jaw tight. "Maybe not, but I ain't done fighting yet." Kettering gave a small nod, almost approving, before looking back toward the path behind them. The hoofbeats had stopped, but the shouts continued, echoing faintly through the canyon. The hunt wasn't over, not even close, and Clay knew the real fight was still ahead. The hollow between the ridges was quiet now, but the silence felt thin, stretched tight over the danger still closing in around them. Clay stayed crouched against the stone, his breath slowing as he listened for every sound. Kettering remained perfectly still, rifle balanced across his knee, his sharp eyes watching the narrow entrance they had slipped through. Somewhere beyond the ridges, voices echoed, faint but clear enough to tell they hadn't given up. Eleanor Hayes' riders were spreading out, their shouts bouncing off the canyon walls, searching for any sign of movement. Clay wiped the sweat and dust from his forehead, glancing at Kettering. "They'll keep looking until morning." Kettering didn't turn his head. "They don't have to find us. They just have to wait. We'll run out of ground eventually." Clay didn't argue, though his jaw tightened. Kettering wasn't wrong. These ridges stretched for miles, twisting like a maze, but sooner or later, Eleanor's men would tighten the noose. Clay's thoughts shifted to the others. Tate, Wheeler, and Sam were somewhere out there in the dark, trying to stay ahead of the same riders. He hoped they'd manage to throw them off their trail, but he knew better than to trust luck. He shifted his weight, his arm aching where the bullet had grazed him earlier. The cut wasn't bad, but it burned now, sticky with half-dry blood. "You're hurt," Kettering said, glancing briefly at the wound. Clay shrugged. "I've had worse." The bounty hunter gave a small, dry smile. "You're stubborn. That'll get you killed one day." "Maybe," Clay said, leaning back against the rock. "But not tonight." The faintest trace of amusement flickered across Kettering's face before it vanished again. His eyes turned back to the ridge entrance, his calm focus returning as quickly as it had broken. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the distant calls of the riders and the occasional gust of wind whistling through the rocks. Finally, Clay spoke again, his tone quieter, more deliberate. "You ever wonder why Eleanor's after this map so bad? Why she sent this many men for it?" Kettering didn't respond immediately, but Clay caught the way his jaw shifted slightly, as if he had considered the same question. "She wants something more than just money," Clay continued. "I've robbed plenty of rich folk, stolen gold, jewelry, even stagecoaches full of payrolls. But this is different. Whatever's on that map, she's willing to kill every man in this canyon to get it." Kettering finally turned his head slightly, his voice even. "What's on it?" Clay looked at him, holding his gaze. "You think I'd tell you before I know if you're going to shoot me or not?" For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between them. Then Kettering looked away again, scanning the ridge. "I don't care what's on it," the bounty hunter said. "I just care about getting paid." Clay almost laughed, though it came out more like a dry breath. "You keep telling yourself that, Kettering. But I've seen the way you look when someone mentions the map. You're curious, maybe more than curious." Kettering didn't answer, but his silence said more than words. The voices outside shifted, growing closer again. Clay tensed, glancing toward the narrow entrance. "They're moving this way," he said quietly. Kettering nodded. "They're sweeping the ridges. We need to move before they box us in." Clay pushed himself to his feet, wincing slightly at the ache in his arm. "There's a split in the rocks about a quarter-mile ahead. Narrow, but it leads deeper into the ridges. They won't expect us to go that way." Kettering stood smoothly, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "Then let's move." They slipped out of the hollow, keeping low as they moved through the narrow gap. The rocky ground crunched softly beneath their boots, every sound magnified by the stillness of the night. Clay led the way, weaving through the twists and turns of the ridge, careful to avoid loose rocks that might give them away. The path grew tighter as they moved, the stone walls pressing close, forcing them to squeeze through in places. After several minutes of silent movement, Clay slowed, glancing back. "You hear that?" Kettering stopped, tilting his head slightly. It was faint at first, almost hidden under the whisper of the wind, but then it grew clearer, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like metal against stone. Not hoofbeats, not voices. Someone was ahead of them. Clay crouched low, motioning for Kettering to do the same. They moved more carefully now, their steps silent as they crept closer. The tapping stopped suddenly, replaced by the sound of movement, boots scraping against rock, hushed voices. Clay pressed himself against the ridge wall, listening. 2 men, maybe 3. Kettering crouched beside him, his voice barely above a whisper. "Scouts. She sent them ahead to cut us off." Clay nodded slowly. They couldn't turn back, not without running straight into the riders behind them. The only way forward was through. He glanced at Kettering, his voice low. "We do this quiet." Kettering gave a single nod, his hand resting on his revolver. They moved closer, sticking to the shadows, until the faint glow of a lantern came into view. 2 men stood near a split in the rocks, one holding the lantern while the other checked the ground for tracks. A third sat on a boulder nearby, his rifle across his lap. Clay counted the distance, his mind running through options. The lantern light flickered against the rocks, casting long shadows. He crouched lower, whispering, "You take the one with the rifle. I'll handle the other 2. Kettering didn't question it. He simply nodded and moved into position, his steps silent against the stone. Clay waited, his heart steady, his breathing slow. Then, in a blur of movement, they struck. Kettering moved first, his arm snapping forward, striking the rifleman across the head with the butt of his revolver. The man crumpled without a sound. Clay lunged at the lantern holder, knocking the light from his hands before he could shout. The third man turned, reaching for his gun, but Clay was faster, slamming him against the rock and covering his mouth with one hand. The fight lasted only seconds before all three men lay unconscious, their weapons scattered on the ground. Clay stepped back, breathing heavier now, his eyes scanning the ridge. No sound yet from the riders behind them. Kettering crouched to pick up the lantern, extinguishing the flame before setting it aside. They'll notice when these three don't report back. Then we keep moving, Clay said, glancing toward the narrow split ahead. We can get deeper into the ridges before they catch on. They slipped past the unconscious men, moving quickly into the tighter gap. The walls pressed closer still, forcing them to move single file. The deeper they went, the darker it became, the moonlight disappearing behind the high rock walls. The air felt cooler here, heavier, carrying the faint smell of dust and stone. Finally, the narrow passage opened into a small hidden hollow, its walls steep and jagged, shielding it from view. Clay stopped, taking a moment to catch his breath. Kettering looked around, scanning the shadows. They won't find this place easily. Good, Clay said, sinking down onto a flat rock. We rest for a bit. Then we move again before dawn. Kettering sat across from him, still alert despite the pause. For a while, neither spoke, the silence stretching between them. Then Kettering finally broke it. That map. What's on it? Clay looked at him, his face unreadable in the dim light. Why do you care? Kettering didn't look away. Because whatever's on it, Eleanor Hayes wants it bad enough to send an army after you. And if I'm risking my neck out here, I need to know why. Clay was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dirt at his boots. Then, finally he spoke, his voice low. It's not gold. It's not money. It's something worse. That map leads to something people will kill for. Kettering's eyes narrowed slightly. And what's that? Clay looked up at him, his gaze hard. A secret Eleanor Hayes would rather bury the whole West to keep hidden. Kettering stared at him for a moment, but before he could ask more, the faint sound of distant voices carried through the ridge again. They were closer this time. The hunt wasn't over. Not even close. The sound of voices drifted through the narrow ridges, closer now, carried on the cold night wind. Clay stiffened where he sat, his hand instinctively moving to his revolver. Kettering rose slowly from the rock where he'd been sitting, his face unreadable but his body tense, ready. They're sweeping the ridges, Clay whispered, keeping his voice low. They'll be on us in minutes. Kettering scanned the narrow hollow, his sharp eyes measuring the terrain. This place was good for hiding, but it's a trap if they corner us. We move now. Clay nodded, already pushing himself to his feet, though his arm burned where the grazing bullet had left its mark. The pain didn't matter now. The hollow felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in as the muffled sounds of Eleanor's men grew louder. Clay glanced toward the narrow passage they had entered through. If they came that way, there would be no time to slip out another route. Kettering looked at him, his voice steady despite the tension. Which way? Clay turned his head slowly, studying the dark walls around them. There was another gap, tight and almost hidden by fallen rock, but just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. He'd noticed it when they first entered, but it led deeper into the ridges, into territory he didn't know well. This way, Clay said, motioning toward it. It'll buy us time. Kettering didn't argue. He moved toward the narrow gap, slipping inside first, his rifle slung across his back. Clay followed, ducking low to fit through, his boots scraping against loose stone. The path twisted sharply, forcing them to move single file. The air grew colder as they moved deeper, the moonlight fading to a dim silver glow through cracks in the rocks above. The smell of dust and dry earth filled Clay's lungs as he moved carefully, his boots crunching softly. The voices behind them grew louder, the men closing in on the hollow they had just left. Clay glanced back once, his heart pounding faster, then pressed on, following Kettering through the tight passage. After several minutes, the narrow path widened slightly, opening into a long stretch of uneven ground surrounded by jagged walls. Clay paused, catching his breath as he scanned the area. "We can lose them in here," Clay said quietly. "Too many turns. Too many places to hide." Kettering shook his head. "They'll bring more men. Once they know we're in this part of the ridge, they'll block every exit." Clay looked at him sharply. "You got a better idea?" Kettering didn't answer, but his silence carried weight. The wind shifted, carrying faint echoes of the men's shouts. Clay crouched low, scanning the rocks for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a small sound broke the stillness, a faint crunch of stone from somewhere ahead. Clay's hand went instantly to his revolver, his eyes narrowing. Kettering heard it too. He raised a hand slightly, signaling Clay to stop. They stayed still, listening. Another soft sound followed, closer this time, like careful footsteps on loose gravel. "They're already ahead of us," Kettering whispered. Clay felt his chest tighten. "Scouts again. They must have come through another pass." Kettering's eyes flicked toward a cluster of large boulders to the right, shadows pooling between them. Two of them, maybe three. Clay crouched lower, his heart pounding harder now. The walls of the ridge amplified every sound, every breath. Kettering leaned closer, his voice just above a whisper. "We can't wait for them to see us first. We take them quietly before they call the others." Clay nodded slowly. He could feel the weight of what was coming. The tension stretched to a breaking point. Kettering moved first, slipping toward the boulders with careful, controlled steps. Clay followed close behind, his revolver ready. The shadows shifted ahead, a flicker of movement, then a faint whisper of voices. Clay could make out two men crouched near the rocks, their backs turned as they scanned the path. One held a lantern, its faint light casting shaky patterns across the walls. The other had a rifle resting against his knee. Clay and Kettering moved closer, every step deliberate, the crunch of stone under their boots almost unbearable in the silence. Then, just as they closed the distance, the man with the lantern turned his head slightly, his eyes catching the faint glint of movement. Clay didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, slamming into the man before he could shout, knocking the lantern from his hands. The glass shattered against the rock, plunging them into darkness. The second man spun, reaching for his rifle, but Kettering was faster. He grabbed the man by the collar, striking him hard against the rock, the dull thud echoing through the ridge. The struggle lasted only seconds, but the sound carried farther than Clay wanted. As the two men slumped to the ground, unconscious, Clay looked toward the narrow path behind them, his pulse racing. The voices outside changed, growing louder, sharper. "They heard that," Kettering said, his tone calm but clipped. Clay glanced at him, his jaw tight. "Then we run." They didn't wait. Moving quickly, they pushed deeper into the ridge, leaving the two unconscious men behind. The path twisted again, splitting into two narrow trails. Clay stopped, his eyes darting between them. "Left or right?" Kettering asked. Clay hesitated only a moment before pointing left. "This way. It slopes downward, might lead to an opening." They moved fast, their boots kicking loose gravel as they ran. The walls loomed higher, the shadows deeper, and the air felt heavier, filled with dust stirred by their passing. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. The riders were coming on foot now, their voices echoing, angry and determined. Clay's chest tightened as they rounded another sharp bend. The path opened slightly, revealing a steep drop ahead where the ridge fell away into darkness. Clay stopped short, skidding slightly on loose rock. The ledge stretched only a few feet before plunging into a dark ravine below. A narrow stone outcropping jutted along the side, barely wide enough to cross. Kettering stepped up beside him, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. "You sure about this? You got a better way?" Clay asked, glancing back toward the sound of approaching men. Kettering didn't argue. He moved first, stepping carefully onto the narrow ledge, his boots scraping against the stone as he balanced against the rock wall. Clay followed, every step deliberate, his fingers brushing against the cold stone for balance. The drop below was deep, the darkness swallowing any sign of the ground. Halfway across, a voice shouted from the ridge behind them. There! There on the ledge! A shot cracked, striking the stone near Clay's foot and sending shards of rock tumbling into the ravine. Move! Kettering called, his voice sharp now, urgency breaking through his usual calm. Clay moved faster, his boots slipping slightly on the narrow rock. Another bullet struck the wall beside him, spraying dust into his face. They reached the other side, just as more shots rang out, echoing across the ridge. Clay ducked behind a boulder, his chest heaving, Kettering crouching beside him. The voices were closer now, shouting orders, boots pounding against stone. They'll try to cross, Kettering said, reloading his rifle quickly. Clay wiped the dust from his face, his jaw set. Then we don't let them. The sound of the first boots hitting the ledge reached them. Clay crouched lower, his revolver ready, his pulse hammering in his ears. The riders were closing in, and the ridge was too narrow for mistakes. One wrong move here meant a long drop into the dark ravine below. Clay tightened his grip on his gun, his eyes fixed on the shadows moving across the ledge. The fight was coming, and there was no running left. The sound of boots scraping against stone grew louder, echoing across the ridge like a warning drum. Clay crouched low, his back pressed against the boulder, his revolver gripped tight in his hand. The night air felt heavier now, thick with dust and tension. Each breath tasted like grit. Kettering crouched beside him, his rifle steady against his shoulder, his sharp eyes fixed on the narrow ledge they had just crossed. His calm hadn't cracked yet, but Clay noticed the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers flexed slightly around the rifle stock. Even Kettering knew this could go bad fast. The first shadow appeared on the ledge. A rider had dismounted and now crept carefully along the narrow stone, balancing against the rock wall. His movements were slow and cautious, but determined. Behind him, another man waited, ready to follow as soon as the first crossed. Clay steadied his breathing, crouched just enough to stay out of sight. The ravine below was silent, a dark, yawning drop waiting for anyone who slipped. Two at a time, Kettering murmured, his voice so quiet it was almost lost to the wind. That ledge won't hold more. Clay nodded slightly. You take the first. I'll handle the second. The first rider moved closer, his boots scraping softly against stone. He clutched his revolver tightly, his eyes darting toward the boulders on Clay's side. Kettering didn't wait for him to make the first move. His rifle barked once, sharp and precise. The bullet struck the rider's shoulder, sending him spinning sideways. His hand clawed at the wall, trying to hold on, but the narrow ledge offered no mercy. He slipped, his body tumbling into the black ravine below. The second man froze, crouching low, his gun raising quickly. Clay leaned out just enough to aim and fired before the man could steady himself. The shot struck him in the leg, and he dropped to his knees with a cry, his hands grasping at the stone. For a second, Clay thought he might pull himself back, but his boots slipped on loose gravel, and he, too, fell screaming into the darkness. The ridge fell silent again, except for the faint echo of rocks tumbling into the ravine below. But the silence didn't last long. Angry shouts rose from the other side, the men realizing what had happened. Clay caught the sound of boots shifting, of orders being barked. They're not giving up, Clay muttered, glancing at Kettering. They'll find another way around, Kettering said, reloading quickly. They're not stupid enough to keep trying the ledge. Clay pushed himself up slightly, scanning the ridge. The path behind them split further ahead, one trail leading upward toward higher ground, the other sloping downward deeper into the twisting ridges. We can't stay here, Clay said. If they circle around, we'll be trapped. Kettering followed his gaze, studying both paths. Which way? Clay hesitated for only a second. The higher ground would give them better sight lines, but it was exposed. The lower trail was tighter, darker, easier to get lost in, but just as easy to get cornered. Down, Clay decided. We keep to the shadows. They'll expect us to go high to try and fight. Kettering nodded, and together they moved quickly, keeping low as they slipped into the sloping trail. The air grew colder as they descended, the walls pressing closer again. The faint light of the moon barely reached here, leaving most of the trail in shadow. Clay's boots crunched softly against the dirt and stone, every step sounding louder than it should. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, except for the faint echo of the riders' voices above. For a brief moment, Clay let himself hope they might actually shake them. But then a new sound reached them. A single sharp whistle cut through the night, bouncing off the walls. Clay froze instantly. "That's not for the men behind us," Kettering said quietly. Clay's stomach tightened. "She's got more men ahead." Almost as if in answer, a faint glimmer of light appeared deeper in the ridge. It flickered like a torch or lantern, moving closer. Kettering crouched, his rifle ready, his eyes narrowing. Scouts again. They're sweeping the lower trails. Clay's mind raced. If Eleanor's men were moving from both directions, the only way out would be to push through whoever was ahead. 4, maybe 5 men, Kettering murmured, his voice steady as he watched the light. "They're spread out, not expecting us to push toward them." "Then we use that," Clay said, already lowering himself closer to the ground. Kettering gave him a quick look. "You're planning to take them head-on?" Clay's eyes stayed locked on the moving light. "Not if I don't have to. But if they see us first, we won't have a choice." The flickering light grew brighter, the faint murmur of voices carrying through the ridge. Clay crouched lower, motioning for Kettering to follow him along a narrow ledge that curved around a cluster of boulders. The shadows were deep here, enough to hide them if they moved carefully. They crept forward, the lantern light drawing closer until Clay could make out the figures. 3 men in the lead, 2 further back. The lead scout carried the lantern, the glow making his silhouette sharp against the rocks. The others scanned the walls cautiously, rifles at the ready, but their focus was outward, not expecting danger from the shadows just ahead of them. Clay glanced at Kettering, signaling with 2 fingers. Kettering nodded once, adjusting his grip on his rifle. They waited, crouched perfectly still, until the scouts were almost even with them. Clay could hear their voices now, the casual confidence of men who didn't think they were being hunted. Then Clay moved. He lunged from the shadows, grabbing the lantern bearer before the man could shout. The lantern crashed to the ground, its light snuffed instantly. The sudden darkness threw the other men into confusion. Kettering fired once, the sharp crack echoing through the ridge as one of the scouts dropped. The others scrambled, shouting, their rifles swinging wildly in the dark. Clay tackled the man closest to him, slamming him into the rock wall. The man struggled, swinging the butt of his rifle, but Clay twisted his arm sharply, sending the weapon clattering to the ground. A shot rang out from somewhere in the dark, the bullet striking the stone near Clay's head. Kettering moved fast, his rifle flashing again as another scout dropped to the ground. The last man stumbled backward, trying to raise his gun, but Clay closed the distance and swung hard with the butt of his revolver, knocking him out cold. The fight lasted only seconds, but the echoes of the gunfire carried far through the ridges. Clay knew Eleanor's men would hear it. He crouched, catching his breath, his chest rising and falling quickly. Kettering lowered his rifle, his calm returning just as fast as the adrenaline had flared. "We can't stay," Kettering said. "They'll be on us in minutes." Clay looked at the trail ahead, the darkness stretching deeper into the ridges. "Then we keep moving." They slipped past the fallen scouts, moving quickly now, their boots crunching softly against the dirt. The ridge twisted tighter as they moved deeper, the walls closing in, the air colder and heavier. Finally, they reached a sharp drop where the ridge sloped into a narrow ravine. Clay crouched at the edge, peering down into the darkness. "This leads out," Clay said, his voice low. "If we follow the ravine, we can reach the far side of the canyon before they cut us off." Kettering crouched beside him, his eyes narrowing as he studied the dark slope. "And if you're wrong?" Clay glanced at him. "Then we're dead anyway." For a brief second, the 2 men just stared at each other, the weight of the moment settling between them. Then Kettering gave a small nod. "After you." Clay swung his legs over the edge, lowering himself carefully before sliding down the slope. The dirt crumbled under his boots, sending small rocks tumbling into the darkness below. Kettering followed, moving just as quietly, though his descent was controlled and precise. The ravine was narrow, the walls steep, but it stretched forward like a dark tunnel leading deeper into the canyon. Clay crouched low, scanning the shadows as he moved. Behind them, the sound of voices grew louder again, closer. Eleanor's men were on their trail, and the hunt was tightening. Clay moved faster, his heart hammering as the ravine twisted ahead. The next turn opened into a wider hollow, moonlight spilling faintly through a break in the ridge above. But before Clay could step inside, he froze. Across the hollow, standing in the pale light, was a figure. A tall man, dressed in dark riding clothes, his hat tilted low, a rifle resting casually against his shoulder. He wasn't surprised to see them. In fact, he was waiting. Clay's chest tightened, his hand tightening around his revolver. The man's voice carried easily through the still air. "Eleanor sends her regards, McGraw." More voices rose around them then, boots crunching against the rocks as shadows shifted along the hollow's edges. They weren't alone. The trap had sprung. Clay didn't move, his boots planted firmly in the dirt as his eyes locked on the man across the hollow. The moonlight caught the rifle in the stranger's hands, glinting faintly off the metal. Around them, shadows shifted, Eleanor's men emerging from their hiding spots along the ridge walls, their rifles trained on Clay and Kettering. Kettering didn't flinch, his rifle still lowered, but his grip tight. His calm expression didn't change, but Clay could see the subtle shift in his posture, the way his weight shifted slightly onto his back foot. He was measuring the distance, planning his first shot. The man across the hollow took a slow step forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You gave us a good run, McGraw," he said, his voice steady, carrying the authority of someone who knew he was in control. "But you should have known you couldn't outrun Eleanor Hayes." Clay stayed silent, his jaw tight, his revolver loose but ready in his hand. The man tilted his head slightly, studying him. "Hand over the map, and maybe you walk out of here alive." Kettering gave a small, sharp laugh, his tone dry. "That's a lie, and we all know it." The man's gaze shifted to Kettering, his expression hardening. "You should have stayed out of this, bounty hunter. You're on the wrong side of this one." Kettering didn't answer, his rifle lowering slightly, not in surrender, but in preparation. Clay exhaled slowly, his eyes flicking between the men surrounding them. There were at least 8, maybe more, scattered along the ridge edges, their rifles glinting faintly in the moonlight. The hollow left little cover, and the ravine behind them was too steep to climb quickly. The man across from them took another step forward. "Last chance, McGraw. You know what's on that map. You know what Eleanor's willing to do to get it. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Clay's jaw tightened. "If she wants it that bad, maybe I shouldn't let her have it." The man's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on his rifle. Kettering shifted slightly closer to Clay, his voice low enough only Clay could hear. "We can't stand here. They'll shoot us where we stand." Clay didn't look at him, his mind racing. The hollow was wide open, but the shadows along the far ridge looked just thick enough to slip through if they moved fast enough. Kettering seemed to sense the same thing. His eyes flicked toward the darker ridge edge, then back at Clay. Clay gave the slightest nod. The man across the hollow took another slow step, raising his rifle slightly. "Your choice, McGraw, but I won't ask again." Clay smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Didn't expect you would." And then he moved. Clay dove to the side, rolling behind a boulder as he fired his first shot. The bullet struck one of the men on the ridge, sending him tumbling. Kettering dropped to one knee instantly, his rifle cracking as he fired 2 quick shots, dropping another man before the rest could react. Chaos erupted. Gunfire exploded through the hollow, the sharp cracks echoing off the ridge walls. Dust and shards of rock filled the air as bullets struck stone, sending sparks flying. Clay crouched behind the boulder, reloading quickly as bullets slammed into the rock just inches from his head. He peeked out, firing twice more, forcing 2 men to dive for cover behind the rocks above. Kettering moved like a man who'd fought 100 gunfights before, his shots precise and fast, each one forcing their attackers to stay low. But they were still badly outnumbered. A bullet struck the edge of Clay's cover, spraying chips of stone across his face. Another whizzed past his ear, close enough that he felt the heat of it. "We can't stay pinned," Clay shouted over the noise. Kettering fired again, dropping another man, then crouched lower. "We move on your mark." Clay glanced toward the dark ridge edge, their only hope of escape. It was 30 feet away, across open ground. If they could reach it, they might slip into the tighter ridges beyond. "On 3, Clay called. Kettering nodded, already preparing to move. Clay took a breath, steadying himself despite the storm of bullets flying around them. 1. A bullet struck the boulder beside him, sending another spray of dust into the air. 2. The man across the hollow shouted an order, his voice sharp over the chaos. More gunfire erupted, bullets tearing through the dirt around them. 3. Clay sprang from behind the boulder, firing as he moved. His boots pounded against the gravel, his heart hammering as he ran toward the ridge edge. Kettering moved with him, his rifle firing quick, precise shots to keep the others pinned. Bullets kicked up dust around their feet, one grazing Clay's coat, another striking a rock so close that shards cut across his cheek. The dark ridge edge loomed closer. Clay dove the last few feet, rolling behind a cluster of rocks. Kettering followed a second later, sliding into the shadows beside him. For a brief second, they were shielded from view. The men on the ridge shouted, their voices angry as they repositioned. Kettering crouched, his breathing controlled despite the run. "We don't have long. They'll circle us." Clay scanned the shadows ahead. The ridge sloped downward again, twisting sharply out of sight. If they moved fast, they might vanish before Eleanor's men cut them off. "Keep moving," Clay said, pushing himself to his feet. They slipped into the narrow path, their boots crunching softly against the dirt. The shadows swallowed them quickly, the ridge walls twisting tighter as they moved deeper. Behind them, the shouts grew louder again. The hunt hadn't stopped. Kettering glanced back briefly, his voice low. "They won't stop now. Not until she has that map." Clay didn't look at him, his eyes locked on the twisting path ahead. "Then we make sure she never gets it." The ridge turned sharply, opening into another hollow, smaller this time, with jagged rocks scattered across the ground. Clay stopped suddenly, crouching low as he scanned the area. The faintest sound reached him, soft footsteps, deliberate, coming from somewhere ahead. Kettering stopped beside him, his rifle ready. More scouts. Clay's grip tightened on his revolver. His pulse pounded faster now, his body coiled like a spring. The footsteps grew closer. Shadows shifted along the ridge wall ahead. Clay crouched lower, his breath steady, waiting for the first figure to appear. The moment stretched long and thin, the silence broken only by the faint crunch of gravel. And then a voice cut through the darkness. "McGraw." Clay froze, his eyes narrowing. The voice was calm, almost casual, but with a sharp edge beneath it. From the shadows ahead stepped another figure, a woman this time, dressed in dark riding clothes, her hat tilted low. Eleanor, Hayes herself. She stood in the pale moonlight, her hands resting easily at her sides, though Clay had no doubt she was armed. Her eyes locked on his, steady and cold. "You've run far enough," she said. Around them, more shadows moved, her men stepping into view, rifles ready. Kettering tensed beside Clay, his rifle lifting slightly, but Clay didn't move, his eyes still locked on Eleanor. The hollow seemed to shrink around them, the tension so tight it felt like the air itself might snap. Eleanor took another slow step forward. "That map, McGraw. Hand it over, or this ends right here." Clay didn't answer. His fingers tightened around his revolver, his mind racing, the weight of the moment pressing down hard. Kettering glanced at him, his jaw set, waiting for his move. The standoff hung for a heartbeat longer. And then, somewhere above, a sharp whistle cut through the night again. Eleanor's eyes flicked briefly upward. It was the smallest distraction. But for Clay McGraw, it might be the only chance he had left. The sharp whistle hung in the cold night air, echoing against the ridge walls like a warning no one expected. Eleanor Hay's head tilted slightly, her sharp eyes flicking toward the sound for only a fraction of a second, but Clay saw it. That tiny moment of distraction was all he needed. He moved first. Clay dropped low, rolling to the side as his revolver cleared its holster. The crack of his shot shattered the tension, sending dust and stone flying as it struck the ridge wall near one of Eleanor's men, forcing him to dive for cover. Kettering moved just as fast, his rifle barking once, dropping another man before the others could react. The hollow erupted in chaos. Eleanor's calm shattered as she darted behind a boulder, shouting orders to her men. Gunfire cracked through the air, bullets slamming into the rocks around Clay and Kettering, sending sharp fragments of stone spinning through the air. Clay crouched low, his back pressed to the cold ridge wall. He fired twice more, forcing Eleanor's men to stay down, but the numbers were against them. There were at least 10 riders in the hollow now, all with rifles trained in their direction. Too many, Kettering shouted over the roar of gunfire, his rifle spitting sparks as he fired again. "We need to move now." Clay scanned the hollow quickly, his mind racing. The path behind them was blocked, and the narrow ravine they had come through was already swarming with Eleanor's men. Then his eyes caught something, a narrow crack in the far ridge wall, half hidden by shadow. It wasn't much wider than a man, but if they could reach it, they might slip through before Eleanor's riders boxed them incompletely. Clay ducked lower as a bullet grazed the rock above his head, sending dust raining down on him. He leaned toward Kettering, shouting over the noise. "There's a gap on the far side. We can make it if we move fast." Kettering didn't hesitate. He nodded once, firing a quick shot to keep the men pinned. "On your lead." Clay took a deep breath, steadying himself for what came next. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his mind was sharp, focused. "Go," he shouted. They broke from cover at the same time, sprinting across the hollow as bullets tore through the dirt around them. Clay felt one graze his coat, close enough to burn against his skin, but he didn't slow. Eleanor shouted something, her voice sharp and furious, and her men opened fire harder, bullets striking the rocks just inches from Clay's boots. Kettering fired twice as he ran, forcing 2 men to duck back behind their cover, buying them precious seconds. The gap loomed closer, a thin slice of darkness between 2 jagged rocks. Clay to the last few feet, sliding into the shadows. Kettering followed a heartbeat later, his rifle raised as he backed into the narrow passage. For a moment, the hollow behind them was a storm of shouting and gunfire. Eleanor's men surged forward, but the narrow crack was too tight for more than one man at a time to follow. Clay crouched low, his back against the cold stone. His breath came hard, his chest rising and falling quickly, but they were alive for now. Kettering glanced back toward the hollow, his rifle still raised. "They'll try to follow." Clay wiped the sweat and dust from his face, his eyes narrowing. "Let him. They'll be crawling through one at a time. Gives us a chance." But before Kettering could answer, a new sound echoed through the narrow passage, a soft shuffle of boots against gravel, coming from deeper inside the ridge. Clay froze, his heart sinking. Someone was already ahead of them. Kettering caught the sound too, his rifle swinging toward the darkness. "Scouts," he murmured. But Clay shook his head slowly, his jaw tightening. The sound wasn't hurried like a scout trying to rush back to Eleanor. It was slow, deliberate. Someone was waiting for them. Then a voice came from the shadows ahead, calm and steady, carrying easily through the narrow passage. "You're not going to like where that path leads, McGraw." Clay stiffened at the voice. It was familiar, too familiar. From the darkness stepped a figure, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and sharp eyes that glinted even in the low light. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that only came from a lifetime of surviving the worst the West could throw at him. "Jesse Coulter," Clay muttered, his voice low, almost disbelieving. The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Been a long time, Clay." Kettering glanced between them, his rifle still raised. "Friend of yours?" Clay's jaw tightened. "Not exactly." Coulter took a slow step forward, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. Eleanor made me an offer I couldn't refuse. Said if I brought you in alive, there's enough money in it to buy my own damn county. Clay's grip tightened around his revolver. Should have known you'd pick the winning side. Coulter's smile widened slightly. Always do. The air in the narrow passage grew tighter, the space between the three men shrinking with every breath. Behind them, the sounds of Eleanor's men trying to force their way through the gap grew louder. Kettering shifted slightly, his rifle steady. "We don't have time for this," he muttered. But Coulter didn't move. He stood calmly, blocking the only way forward, his hand resting on his gun like he had all the time in the world. "You're trapped, Clay," Coulter said simply. "Behind you is Eleanor's army, and ahead of you is me. You know how this ends." Clay didn't answer, his mind racing. Coulter was fast, maybe faster than Clay had ever been, and the tight space left little room for movement. But if he didn't do something, Eleanor's men would catch up, and there'd be no way out. The seconds stretched long, the tension tightening like a rope pulled too hard. Then, without warning, the rocks above them shifted with a low groan, and a shower of dust fell from the ridge walls. Clay glanced up sharply, his pulse spiking. The ridge was unstable. Coulter glanced upward too, his eyes narrowing as a few small stones tumbled from the ceiling. Kettering caught it immediately, his voice sharp. "If that wall gives, we're all buried." The low groan grew louder, a deep rumble shaking the narrow passage. For the first time, Coulter's calm cracked slightly, his stance shifting as he glanced at the ridge walls. Clay's eyes narrowed, his mind making the decision before he could think too long. "Then maybe we use it," Clay said under his breath. Kettering shot him a quick look, realizing what he meant, but before he could respond, Clay stepped forward, raising his revolver slightly. Coulter's eyes snapped back to him, his hand tightening on his gun. "Don't." But Clay didn't stop. His eyes stayed locked on Coulter's, his finger tightening on the trigger. The rumble grew louder, the rocks above them shifting dangerously. Clay knew he had only one shot, one reckless chance that might bury all of them or open a way out, and he was about to take it. The rumble in the ridge grew louder, echoing like distant thunder, sending vibrations through the narrow passage. Clay's fingers tightened around his revolver, his mind set. There was no time to hesitate, not with Eleanor's men closing in behind them and Coulter standing like a wall ahead. Coulter's sharp eyes never left him, his hand resting on the butt of his gun, ready to draw. "Don't be stupid, McGraw," he said, his voice low but firm. "You shoot, we all die under this rock." Clay's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "Maybe, but I'd rather take my chances with Falling Stone than with Eleanor." Kettering shifted slightly behind Clay, his rifle steady, his expression unreadable, though Clay could feel the tension radiating off him. Kettering was ready to move, ready to back Clay's gamble, even if it meant bringing the whole ridge down. Coulter gave a small, humorless laugh, his boots shifting slightly on the gravel. "You always were the reckless one. Thought maybe you'd grown wiser with age." "Guess not," Clay said, his voice hard. The rumble deepened, small stones rattling loose from the ridge walls, showering the narrow passage. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling around them like smoke. For a split second, the three men stood locked in place, tension stretched to the breaking point. Then Clay moved. He fired, not at Coulter, but the ridge wall above him. The bullet struck the stone with a sharp crack, sending more rocks tumbling. The ridge groaned in protest, the sound almost deafening in the confined space. Coulter's eyes widened slightly, his hand jerking toward his gun. But before he could fire, another loud crack echoed as a section of the ridge ceiling gave way, crashing down between them. The passage exploded into chaos. Dust filled the air, choking and blinding. Rocks tumbled, clattering against the walls as the ridge shook under the strain. Clay dove sideways, dragging Kettering with him as a section of stone crashed down where they had been standing just moments before. Coulter stumbled backward, his figure barely visible through the thick cloud of dust. His voice carried faintly through the rumble. "You're insane, McGraw." Clay didn't answer. He pushed himself to his feet, coughing through the dust, and motioned for Kettering to follow. The section of the ridge where the rocks had fallen now created a temporary barrier between them and Eleanor's men. It wouldn't hold forever, but it bought them precious seconds. Through the haze, Clay caught sight of Coulter moving quickly, retreating deeper into the passage. "He's going to cut us off again," Kettering said, his voice sharp as he coughed against the dust. "Not if we move first," Clay replied. They pushed forward through the settling debris, their boots slipping on loose gravel. The narrow passage twisted sharply ahead, vanishing into deeper darkness. The air grew colder, heavier, and the sound of distant rumblings still echoed, as if the ridge hadn't finished settling. Kettering moved close behind Clay, his rifle raised as his sharp eyes scanned the shadows. That shot woke the whole ridge. "We might not have much time before the rest of it comes down." Clay nodded, his jaw tight. "Then we keep moving until we find daylight." But daylight still felt far away. As they moved deeper, the passage widened slightly into another hollow, dimly lit by moonlight seeping through cracks above. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen rocks, and the walls loomed high, jagged and cold. Clay stopped suddenly, crouching low as he scanned the hollow. Kettering crouched beside him, his voice low. "You see something?" Clay didn't answer immediately. His sharp eyes caught something in the dirt, a set of fresh boot tracks, pressed deep into the loose gravel. "They're not Eleanor's men," Clay said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "She didn't get here yet. These tracks belong to someone who knows these ridges." Kettering studied the prints, his brow furrowing. "Coulter," Clay nodded. "He's not running. He's leading us somewhere." Kettering's gaze sharpened. "You think he's setting another trap?" Clay's jaw tightened. "I know he is." The realization settled heavy between them. Coulter wasn't just blocking their escape. He was playing his own game. And if Clay knew Jesse Coulter, he wasn't doing it for Eleanor. He was doing it for himself. The thought made Clay's stomach twist. Whatever Coulter was planning, it meant the stakes were higher than just Eleanor's bounty. The hollow stretched ahead, splitting into two paths, one sloping downward, disappearing into darker shadows, and the other climbing sharply toward what looked like a narrow ledge. Clay crouched, studying both trails. "He'll be waiting on the high ground," Kettering said quietly, his eyes scanning the upper trail. "That's where I'd set an ambush." Clay nodded slightly. "Which means we take the lower trail." Kettering gave him a quick look. "You sure? If he's betting we'll avoid the high ground, he might be waiting below instead." Clay allowed himself a faint, humorless smile. "That's what he's counting on. Coulter knows I don't walk into a blind corner. Which means this time I do exactly that." Kettering stared at him for a moment, then nodded, trusting Clay's instinct despite the risk. They moved quickly down the lower trail, their boots crunching softly against the gravel. The air grew colder as the walls closed in again, shadows swallowing them deeper into the ridge. Clay's pulse quickened with every step. He could feel Coulter somewhere ahead, waiting, watching. The man always had a way of staying 2 steps ahead, but this time Clay needed to outthink him. The trail twisted again, opening into another small hollow. Clay stopped just at the edge, crouching low as his sharp eyes scanned the area. The hollow was quiet, too quiet. The moonlight cast sharp angles across the rocks, leaving deep shadows where anything could hide. Kettering crouched beside him, his rifle raised. "You think he's here?" Clay nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's here." The silence stretched, heavy and tense, every second dragging longer. Then, from the shadows above, a voice spoke, calm and steady. "Knew you'd take the low trail, McGraw." Clay didn't look up immediately, his jaw tightening. "You always did like making an entrance, Coulter." Coulter stepped from the shadows onto a narrow rock ledge above them, his silhouette sharp in the pale light. His rifle rested casually against his shoulder, but Clay knew better than to mistake that relaxed stance for carelessness. "You're predictable," Coulter said, his tone almost amused. "You play clever when you're scared, but you always come right where I need you." Clay's eyes stayed locked on him, his grip tightening on his revolver. "Then why aren't you pulling the trigger?" Coulter gave a faint smile. Because Eleanor doesn't pay me if you're dead, but she doesn't mind if you're broken enough to stop running. The words barely left his mouth before a sharp metallic snap echoed through the hollow. Clay's eyes darted toward the sound, just as he caught sight of a wire glinting faintly in the moonlight, stretched across the ground near his boots. A trap. But before he could react, something shifted under the rocks ahead, a low mechanical groan followed by a sudden rush of movement. The ground gave way. Clay jumped back instinctively, but the dirt beneath his boots crumbled, sliding into a pit hidden under loose gravel. Kettering grabbed his arm, pulling him back at the last second, but the sudden drop sent both of them tumbling toward the edge. Clay's hand scraped against the rocks as he tried to steady himself, his boots slipping closer to the pit. Kettering's grip tightened on his coat, pulling him back just as the loose gravel spilled away into the dark hole below. The pit yawned open like a mouth, deep and dark, lined with jagged rocks. Coulter stood above them, his silhouette framed in the moonlight, his expression calm as ever. "Don't fight it, McGraw," he called down. "You're boxed in. No way out this time." Clay pushed himself to his feet slowly, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on Coulter. For the first time, Clay saw it clearly. Coulter wasn't just working for Eleanor. He had planned this whole chase, every turn through the ridges, every ambush. And now, with Eleanor closing in behind them, Clay was trapped between two enemies, one who wanted him alive, and one who didn't care if he ever walked out of these ridges again. Clay's grip tightened on his revolver, his jaw set. This wasn't just about escaping anymore. This was about surviving Coulter. Clay's breath came in sharp bursts, his chest rising and falling as he stared up at Jesse Coulter. The man stood steady on the ridge ledge, his rifle leveled, his boots planted firm like he owned the entire canyon. Behind Clay, the sound of Eleanor's men grew closer, their shouts echoing through the narrow passage. Tom was slipping away fast. Kettering crouched beside him, his rifle still raised, his sharp eyes darting between the pit ahead and the ledge above. "We're out of time," he said, his voice low but certain. "We can't stay pinned." Clay didn't answer right away. His mind raced, his jaw tight. Coulter had set every step of this chase, pulling him right into this trap. But Coulter's mistake was thinking Clay would follow the rules of his game. Slowly, Clay crouched lower, his fingers tightening around his revolver. "I'm not staying boxed in," he muttered under his breath. Coulter heard him, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "Don't try anything, McGraw. You move wrong, and you won't get back up." Clay looked up at him, his eyes narrowing. "You talk too much for someone who's supposed to be in control." For the first time, Coulter's sharp eyes flickered just slightly. It was the smallest shift, but Clay caught it. The rumble of Eleanor's men grew louder behind them. The ridge vibrated faintly under their boots as they forced their way through the narrow gap. Clay moved. He didn't aim for Coulter. Instead, he spun and fired at the ridge wall above Coulter's ledge. The bullet struck the already weakened stone, cracking it deeper. Coulter's eyes widened as the ledge beneath him groaned. "McGraw!" he shouted, stepping back, but it was too late. The rock gave way with a sharp crack, sending Coulter sliding down the slope. His rifle clattered against the rocks as he grabbed for anything to stop his fall, but the loose gravel betrayed him. Clay darted forward as Coulter slid toward the pit. He didn't think, he just grabbed. His hand locked onto Coulter's coat at the last second, stopping him inches from the edge. Coulter looked up at him, his sharp eyes wide with surprise. Clay's grip tightened, his boots digging into the dirt as he held him there. Behind them, Eleanor's men spilled into the hollow, shouting as they fanned out. Kettering fired quickly, his rifle cracking as he kept them pinned. "We don't have long, Clay," he shouted. Clay gritted his teeth, pulling Coulter back from the edge. "You set this whole thing up," he said, his voice low but hard. "But you're not dying here, not like this." Coulter's breath came hard, his eyes narrowing. "You should have let me fall. You're a fool, McGraw." Clay dragged him on his solid ground, releasing him once he was clear of the pit. Coulter lay there for a second, breathing heavily, before pushing himself up. The gunfire behind them grew heavier. Kettering ducked behind a rock, firing another shot. We're about to be surrounded. Clay grabbed Coulter by the arm, pulling him close. You want out of here alive? You help us get through Eleanor's men. Coulter stared at him for a long second, his sharp eyes calculating. Then, with a small, bitter smile, he nodded. Fine, but this doesn't mean I'm on your side. Clay didn't waste time answering. He turned, crouching low as bullets struck the rocks around them. Kettering gave him a sharp look, surprised at Coulter standing with them, but didn't argue. Left flank's lighter. Kettering shouted over the gunfire. Clay nodded. We push through there. Coulter, you keep them off us. Coulter gave a sharp grin, raising his rifle. Don't get in my way. They moved as one, darting from cover to cover. Coulter fired first, his shots precise, forcing Eleanor's men to dive for cover. Kettering moved with sharp efficiency, picking off any who tried to push forward. Clay stayed low, moving fast, his revolver barking as he cleared the path ahead. The left flank was lighter, just as Kettering had said, but Eleanor's men were regrouping quickly. One rider stepped out from behind a rock, his rifle raised, but Coulter dropped him with a clean shot before he could fire. The three of them pushed forward, the sound of boots and shouts fading behind them as they slipped into another narrow passage. They didn't stop until the ridge widened into an open canyon bathed in silver moonlight. The air felt colder here, but it was open space, free from the walls that had boxed them in for so long. Kettering crouched low, scanning the ridges. We're not safe yet. They'll follow. Clay nodded, his chest still heaving. His eyes darted to Coulter, who leaned against a boulder, his rifle resting on his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Eleanor's shouts echoed faintly in the distance, her voice sharp and furious. She was close, but for now, they had a head start. Coulter finally spoke, his voice low. You should have let me fall back there. Would have saved you trouble later. Clay looked at him, his jaw set. Maybe, but I'm not like you, Coulter. Coulter gave a faint, almost amused smile. No, you're not. Ketter glanced between them, his sharp eyes narrowing. We can't stay here. They'll be on us soon. Clay nodded, scanning the canyon ahead. There were still choices to make, still danger waiting in the shadows, but for the first time that night, they had a chance to breathe. Then, just as he took a step forward, a single gunshot rang out from the ridges above. The bullet struck close, kicking up dirt near Clay's boots. He spun, his revolver ready, his heart hammering. From the ridge above, Eleanor Hayes herself appeared, her silhouette sharp against the moonlight. Her rifle glinted as she leveled it directly at him. You didn't think you were walking out of here, did you, McGraw? She called, her voice cold and steady. Clay's jaw tightened, his grip on his revolver firming as he stared up at her. The night wasn't over yet, and the fight was far from finished. The night air felt heavier than ever, the canyon walls seeming to press in as Clay stood frozen, revolver raised, staring up at Eleanor Hayes. She stood high on the ridge, the moonlight cutting across her sharp features, her rifle trained squarely on him. Kettering crouched low behind a boulder, his rifle ready, while Coulter shifted slightly, his calm expression betraying just a hint of tension. Throw the gun, McGraw, Eleanor called down, her voice steady, no trace of doubt. You made it far, but this is where it ends. You're walking out with me, or not at all. Clay didn't move. His fingers flexed slightly against the worn grip of his revolver, his eyes locked on hers. You'll have to take me alive, he said, his voice low and even. Eleanor gave the faintest smile, tilting her head. That's the plan. Suddenly, she fired, not at Clay, but the ground near his feet, the bullet kicking up dirt. Clay jerked back instinctively, dust clouding the air around him. She fired again, forcing him to move, trying to drive him into the open where he'd have no cover. Kettering cursed under his breath, shifting to get a better angle, but Eleanor's position on the ridge was too good. She had the high ground, every line of sight covered. Clay crouched lower, heart pounding, his mind racing. There had to be a way to break her line of fire. His eyes darted to Coulter, who stood a few paces back, still as stone, his rifle lowered. Coulter wasn't aiming at Eleanor. He wasn't even trying. Coulter, Clay hissed, his voice tight. Do something. Coulter gave him a look, calm and almost amused. This isn't my fight, McGraw. You made this mess. Clay glared at him, anger flaring, but before he could speak, Eleanor shifted her rifle, aiming at Kettering now. "Drop it, Kettering," she called. "You're not stupid enough to die for him." Kettering's jaw tightened, his rifle still steady, but his eyes darted to Clay, waiting for a sign. Clay's mind worked fast, his thoughts tumbling over one another. Eleanor was too focused, too careful. A straight fight would get them both killed. Then, as Eleanor adjusted her aim slightly, Clay noticed something, a small, jagged crack running through the rock just below where she stood. The ridge was unstable, the same unstable ridges he had used before to trap Coulter. It was risky. One bad shot, and the ridge could bury all of them under falling rock. But it was the only chance. Clay exhaled slowly, steadying his hand. Eleanor's sharp eyes stayed on Kettering. Her attention split just for a second. Clay fired. The bullet struck the crack in the rock, sending a sharp crack echoing through the canyon. Eleanor spun toward him, realizing too late what he had done. The rock beneath her boots shifted, crumbling. With a sharp cry, Eleanor lost her footing as the edge of the ridge gave way. She dropped her rifle as she tumbled down the slope, sliding through loose gravel and dirt. Clay darted forward, grabbing her arm just as she slid past him. He pulled hard, bracing himself against the rocks, his boots digging into the gravel. Eleanor's sharp eyes met his, wide with shock. For a tense second, neither moved, both breathing hard. Clay's grip tightened as he hauled her back on a solid ground. She collapsed to her knees, coughing through the dust, her once calm face now flushed with anger and disbelief. "You should have let me fall," she spat, her voice sharp. Clay stood over her, his revolver still in his hand, his jaw tight. "I'm not you, Eleanor." Coulter stepped closer, his rifle still casually at his side, but his eyes were sharper now, curious. "You keep saving people who want you dead. That's going to get you killed one day." Clay ignored him, focusing on Eleanor, who sat on the ground, breathing hard. "It's over," he said quietly. Eleanor looked up at him, her sharp eyes narrowing, then, unexpectedly, she smiled. It wasn't her usual mocking grin. It was something colder. "You think this ends with me?" Clay's brow furrowed, his grip tightening on the revolver. "What are you talking about?" She gave a faint laugh, shaking her head. "You really don't know what's in that map you're carrying, do you?" The words hit him harder than he expected. "What do you mean?" Eleanor's smile widened slightly, even as Kettering moved in to secure her. "You're chasing something bigger than gold, McGraw. That map isn't just treasure. It's a key, one that everyone out here would kill for. And you're carrying it straight to them." Before Clay could answer, a single sharp whistle cut through the canyon. Clay spun toward the sound, his revolver raised. From the ridge above, a new group of riders appeared, their silhouettes sharp against the moonlight. They weren't Eleanor's men. Their horses were heavier, their faces covered in dark scarves, their weapons glinting in the pale light. Kettering cursed under his breath, tightening his grip on Eleanor's arm. "Who the hell are they?" Eleanor gave a low chuckle, despite being bound. "You're about to find out." Coulter's sharp eyes narrowed, his rifle raising slowly as he studied the riders. "Well, McGraw," he said, his voice calm but edged with amusement. "Looks like your night's not over after all." Clay's jaw tightened as the riders began to descend into the canyon, their movements precise, practiced. Whoever they weren't just passing through. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of horseshoes striking stone and the faint creak of leather. Clay glanced at Eleanor, who sat calmly despite her tied hands, her smile returning. "Welcome to the real hunt," she said softly. Clay tightened his grip on the revolver, his pulse steadying. The chase for gold had just turned into something much bigger, and as the riders closed in, he knew this was only the beginning. The night stretched long and cold, the moon casting silver light over the canyon as the first of the new riders stepped into view, their leader pulling down his scarf to reveal a face Clay didn't expect to ever see again. And just like that, the real danger began. The canyon seemed to hold its breath as the new riders approached, their horses moving with the steady rhythm of men who knew exactly where they were going. Clay tightened his grip on his revolver, his sharp eyes never leaving the lead rider. Kettering shifted slightly, keeping Eleanor bound but close, his rifle steady, while Coulter leaned against a boulder, his face unreadable, though his fingers were tense on the trigger. The leader rode closer, his scarf pulled down, and the sight of him made Clay's jaw tighten. It was Ryder Cole, a name that still carried weight in the West. A man once thought dead, a ruthless outlaw whose reputation had filled campfire stories for years. Ryder was older now, his hair streaked with gray, but his eyes were the same, sharp, cold, calculating. "McGraw," Ryder said calmly, swinging down from his horse. "Didn't expect to find you in my canyon." Clay stayed still, his revolver raised but steady. "Wasn't looking for you." Ryder smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You're carrying something that belongs to me." His gaze shifted to Clay's coat, to where the folded map sat hidden. "That map isn't just a scrap of paper. It's the key to something bigger than you can imagine, and I've been waiting a long time to get it back." Eleanor gave a soft laugh from where she sat tied against the rock. "Told you, Clay. You've been running in the wrong game this whole time." Clay's jaw tightened, his mind racing. He had carried the map for weeks, thinking it led to gold. Maybe enough to buy himself out of this life, to finally put the past behind him. But Ryder's words, and Eleanor's knowing smirk, made it clear this was never about gold. Whatever the map led to, it was worth more than money, maybe more than anyone could handle. "I'm not giving it to you," Clay said firmly. Ryder didn't look surprised. He tilted his head slightly, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. "You don't have much choice. You hand it over, or my men take it off you." Coulter finally spoke, his tone calm, almost amused. "You could just shoot him and be done with it, Ryder. Why waste time talking?" Ryder's sharp eyes flicked to Coulter, narrowing slightly. "Because McGraw's not stupid. He knows if he destroys that map, none of us get what we want." Clay's grip tightened on his revolver, the tension stretching like a drawn wire. Kettering moved closer to him, his rifle raised, his voice low. "We can't fight all of them, Clay. There are too many." Clay stayed silent for a long moment, his thoughts spinning. He couldn't let Ryder have a map. Whatever it led to, putting it in Ryder's hands would mean chaos for everyone. Eleanor, Coulter, even the small towns scattered across the West. Finally, Clay lowered his revolver slightly, his voice calm. "You're right, Ryder. You're not taking it off me." Ryder gave a small nod, as if he'd expected this, then handed over. But instead of reaching into his coat, Clay slowly crouched and pulled a small piece of flint from his belt. Before anyone could react, he struck it against his revolver barrel, sparks flying into the dry grass at his feet. The map, tucked in his coat pocket, caught fire instantly, the dry paper curling and blackening in seconds. Ryder's eyes widened, his calm expression breaking for the first time. "McGraw," he shouted, stepping forward. Clay pulled the burning map from his coat, holding it high as the flames consumed it completely. He didn't move, didn't flinch, even as Ryder's men raised their rifles. "It's gone," Clay said firmly, watching the last piece of the map turn to ash. "Whatever you were looking for, it's over." The canyon fell silent. Ryder stood frozen, his sharp eyes locked on Clay, his jaw tight. For a long moment, it seemed he might draw his gun, but then he slowly stepped back, his expression cold as stone. "You just made a lot of enemies, McGraw," Ryder said quietly, "and you'll regret this." Clay didn't answer, his revolver still steady, his eyes unyielding. Ryder gave a sharp signal to his men, and one by one, they mounted their horses. Without another word, they rode back into the shadows of the canyon, their figures swallowed by the night. Eleanor sat against the rock, her sharp eyes watching them leave, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You just burned the only thing keeping you alive, Clay." Clay turned to her, his expression calm. "Maybe, but at least they can't use it now." Kettering exhaled, lowering his rifle slightly. "You just threw away a fortune." Clay shook his head. "Some things aren't worth buying." Coulter tilted his head, studying him, his usual smirk returning. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met, or the dumbest. Hard to tell which." Clay holstered his revolver, his jaw tightening. "Doesn't matter. It's done." The tension slowly faded from the canyon, replaced by the soft whisper of the night wind. Kettering untied Eleanor, who sat quietly, no longer smiling, though her sharp eyes still burned with anger. "What now?" Kettering asked, glancing at Clay. Clay looked out toward the dark ridges stretching beyond the canyon. "Now we leave this place behind. Whatever was on that map, it's better buried." Coulter gave a small chuckle. "You can bury it all you want, McGraw, but some things don't stay buried for long." Clay didn't answer. He turned, walking toward the open trail leading out of the canyon, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. Kettering followed close behind, and after a moment, Coulter fell in step beside them, his calm grin still in place. The three of them moved silently under the silver moonlight, the canyon slowly shrinking behind them. Whatever lay ahead, Clay knew one thing for sure. He had chosen the harder road, the road that didn't promise gold or glory, but something far rarer in the West: peace of mind. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sounds of distant riders, but Clay didn't look back. The night was quiet again, and for now, that was enough. As they disappeared into the shadows of the open desert, the ashes of the burned map scattered in the canyon wind, carried far away, lost to history forever. And with that, Clay McGraw rode on, not a hero, not an outlaw, just a man who had finally learned when to let go.